General Robert E. Lee once said, "A land without memories is a people without freedom." We would go a step further and say that a people without memories is a people who doesn't know who they are today. Since the cannons cooled at Appomattox, we of the South have been taught to despise our past. The Yankee set out on a mission of peace with the goal of conquest to reshape the Southerner in his image, to change our vocabulary, enlighten us with their morality, and force our children to remember a history that is not their own.
Welcome to Charlie Horse Radio, a conversational podcast on Southern history and culture, which has for its goal restoring the memory and freedom of this land. We are Jason and John, two Orthodox Christians with a love for the South. If you enjoy this show and would like to support, please consider subscribing on Substack for free or for $5 a month or $50 a year.
Well, you're gonna pull those pistols or whistle Dixie. If I get to liking someone, they ain't around long.
I notice when you get to disliking someone, they ain't around for long either.
Pretty sure we have time to bury them fellas.
Hell with them fellas. Buzzards gotta eat, same as worms.
From 1830 to 1861, the North and South quarreled with a savage fury that was unknown in the history of any country whose sections had been bound together by voluntary agreement. Finally, war came, and the war which came was a war such as history had never recorded until that date. Over 3 millions of men from first to last marched forth to deadly combat, and nearly 1 million went down. This, out of a population of little more than 25 millions of white men, meant that nearly 1 man in every 6 went to war. Europe first smiled contemptuously at the armed mobs of civilian soldiers who ran from one another at First Manassas, but stood pop-eyed with wonder and awe when Anglo-Saxons stood within 10 paces of one another at Chickamauga and fired point blank, mowing down 1/3 of the combatants, or marched up Cemetery Ridge at Gettysburg as on dress parade, or charged 20 deep at Cold Harbor with their addresses pinned to their backs so that their dead bodies might be identified after being torn by artillery at close range. End quote. And that is the first paragraph of The Irrepressible Conflict by Frank Lawrence Owsley, which is the third essay in the book I'll Take My Stand. Welcome to Charlie Horse Radio. I'm Jason, and I'm here with John. What's up, John?
How y'all doing?
And we have a guest here with us today to talk about this essay. He goes by Society of Archangel Michael on Substack, and I'll go ahead and let him introduce himself. So how's it going?
Hey, y'all. First off, thank y'all for having me on this. It's my first time being on a podcast in general, and it's also great to talk to some Southerners who are also Orthodox Christians. I'm sure, as y'all know, that ain't the majority around here.
Yeah. What is the majority where you are?
Well, I actually grew up Southern Baptist, so it's probably Southern Baptist.
Yeah, I would imagine.
Because I'm from Texas, so it's probably good amount of Catholics, but those are usually Mexican. So if they're white Americans, it's usually Southern Baptist.
Ah,
Yeah. A lot of Southern Baptists and Methodists.
Y'all had Baptist and Methodist where y'all from?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I grew up.
I think they're all
mostly.
over.
I grew up Methodist for a lot of my life. Yeah.
Well, yeah, this essay I thought was the most important of all the essays to me because it really goes to the settled dogma of what appears to be the settled dogma of the North versus South, that it was just a black and white slavery versus freedom thing. And it was really important at digging into agrarianism in general and just the whole history of the irrepressible conflict, as Owsley calls it. And so I'm especially glad that y'all had me on for this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Is there anything you want to tell people about that you do before we get started? Like, what do you do on Substack mostly?
My Substack, mostly I talk anything from law, politics, sometimes orthodoxy. But no, I try to stay away so much from writing about orthodoxy because mostly I want to focus on law and politics, and partly because I'm scared to say something that's not exactly right.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
I'm,
Now,
Yeah,
I'm of
you
the mind
are
that I don't have a blessing to talk about theology, so I don't mostly.
Exactly.
Like,
that's exactly right. You have,
yeah.
now you are a lawyer, right?
yes, sir.
Okay.
I am,
Oh,
and
I didn't know
so
that. What kind of law do you practice?
well, I do a lot of like different things. I'm in the military, actually. I'm a JAG.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Cool.
So right now, I mean, I just graduated just like the past year. And so I'm very, very recent. So just general stuff right now.
Sweet.
Nice. Very cool.
So
Yeah, and so-
I had
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, you're fine. So leading up to this essay, I had posted a note asking if anyone knew where the title to this book comes from, The Irrepressible Conflict. Before I give it away, do either of y'all know?
No.
I don't know. I should know, but I don't.
So it was not a title that was made just for this essay. It actually came from Seward, and he said it in 1958. And on the topic, President Davis says, quote, Mr. Seward of New York, as we have seen, was a member of that committee, the man who in 1858 had announced the irrepressible conflict, and who in the same year, speaking of and for abolitionism, had said, it has driven you back in California and in Kansas. It will invade your soul. He was to be the Secretary of State in the incoming administration and was very generally regarded as the power behind the throne, greater than the throne itself. He was present in the Senate, but made no response to Mr. Douglas's demand for a declaration of policy. And then Jeff Davis continues, no wonder then that under the shadow of the failure of every effort in Congress to find any common ground on which the sections could be restored to amity, the close of the year should have been darkened by a cloud in the firmament, which had lost even the silver lining so long seen or thought to be seen by the hopeful. So yeah, this title goes all the way back to prior to the war and was something that was being talked about in the Senate and in the highest levels of government, starting off, of course, with the Kansas Missouri border wars, and the way that the North feared that the slave states would take power in the federal government. So yeah, that was, I think Wolliver actually got that. I think he actually said it was Seward in 1858. But yeah, so this
he would know that.
Goes back all the way that far prior to the war.
Yeah.
Well,
You know what struck?
That
You know
seems
what?
to be sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was about to say that seems to be the general theme of what we're trying to get at here, and what Owsley wrote is that all this stuff goes back to well before the war.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
what struck me about it is that you know how in the normie Civil War discourse, it's like you'll always see the causes of the war presented as like a dichotomy between slavery and states' rights.
Yeah.
Like, what was the South fighting for? Like the Yankees and shit libs will say they were fighting for slavery.
Yeah.
And the Southern good old boys will say they were fighting for states' rights. But what struck me about this essay is that it doesn't take that tack at all. It's like, he does talk about states' rights in here, but he breaks the dialectic, kind of like he's like investigating much more root causes than that. He's like, these are almost like the aesthetics or the coat of paint that gets slapped on the conflict in the end, but really the roots of it are much, much deeper than either one of those things.
Yeah. And this goes back as far as
some of the stuff he talks about here, and we'll get into as we get into the actual text, but a lot of this goes back as far as the founding fathers themselves, and the recognition. This is why like William and Mary University existed, because Virginians didn't want Virginians being educated in the North and learning from them. They knew they were a managerial class and merchant class of people. They knew that it would corrupt the agrarianism of the South. They would corrupt the Southern way of life and Southern morality. And so this is stuff that goes all the way back. I mean, if you read like, what was his name? David McCullough's 1776. And he has some good anecdotes in there about how much Washington hated Northerners at the beginning of the war. He couldn't stand them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all a part of, I mean, they were a fundamentally different culture. They were different peoples. And that's the root cause of the war. And it was always going to be irrepressible. There was no way to actually stop it.
Yeah.
And I think actually this Owsley does a great job of talking about, as you did, is it starts really with the colonists, but I would actually go back as far as, I'm going to feel like that Putin Tucker Carlson meme, but I would say it actually goes back to Alfred the Great back in England.
Yeah.
Because when you have there is that you kind of have a conflict between people who are on either sides of the centralization versus decentralization, or the kind of religious and ethnic divides within England himself. So for instance, Alfred the Great was obviously a king, but he was a very decentralized ruler who wanted powers and state security to be held in the local villages, when they would be run by sheriffs. It was called the fyrd system, whereas if they were invaded, they wouldn't have one centralized army under Alfred, because they would fear that would be tyrannical. And so in England, that basically wherever there was a conflict, the local sheriff, which is a same name but different role than we have sheriffs now, he was basically the leader of the local militia. And then you get 1066, the French come, the French take over, and they have a centralized army. And the centralized army of the French is used to oppress the Anglo-Saxons, or the English. And so from then on, it became centralized power is tyranny, localized power is the English way, and it's freedom. And then that continues on throughout English history, waxes and wanes, until we get to America. And you can see the exact same people. Jefferson Davis talked about it. The exact same people are on the exact same sides of the conflict.
Yeah.
Which is
I still haven't read what's that book called about Albion Seed? That's what I'm thinking of. I still haven't read it. I know I need to one of these days. But like, is that kind of where the Puritans come from? Is that stock?
Yeah, I haven't either.
That took
the Puritans came later. That was when the English Civil Wars really is when you get the parliamentarians versus the royalists. And
I know that, but like, is that the stock they come from? Is the Normans?
Oh, I actually don't know that one. That's actually a good question to look up. That would be really interesting.
Yeah. I think we got a little bit of a lag. I don't know if you guys are hearing me a little bit delayed.
I hear you good. I'm not sure though. I'm not the best with technology.
Going back to what you had said, Marco, with the sort of not eternal conflict, but this long English heritage and Anglo-Saxon heritage of opposing tyranny. This is one of the reasons why I understand the critiques of like the American way of life being, a liberal founded on Enlightenment ideals, blah, blah, blah. But there is also something deeply true when you read early American documents, the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, things like that, where they're not revolting against the king based on Enlightenment principles. They're actually appealing to the English rights that their fathers had before them and their fathers before them.
Exactly.
Saying like Jefferson's tract, the rights on British America, just something that was contractual or that you guys granted us when you sent or when Anglos came to the New World. This is something that our fathers and grandfathers, all the way back to King Alfred, this is something that we enjoyed, was freedom and liberty and decentralization. So when they were opposing the king, they were actually the ones defending the traditional English way of life.
Exactly. And then you're right. It's a point that people bring up, which is like, oh, the post-enlightenment ideals of liberalism, and it's the fruit of the
But
poisonous
it gets
tree.
muddied
And it
up a
wasn't
lot
gonna
with the
exactly.
yeah.
And so, like, for instance, this is my biggest problem with a lot of the Civil War discourse in America is a lot of people, I would say, the most ardent defenders of the North who love to just make fun of and laugh at the South are people whose ancestors weren't even in the Civil War, or immigrants, or like
Yeah.
Chinese or black, or not really. I'm not even saying black, like African immigrants, not even the descendants of the slaves. Like they will come here in this because they don't understand the history behind the English culture
Yeah.
behind it, and they can't understand it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to your point,
Yeah.
John, I mean, the Confederate leaders like Secretary of State Toombs or even President Jefferson Davis, they wrote specifically that this war was a continuation of what they had in England. Like I have this quote from Jefferson Davis, who said that when the men of the North shall refuse to recognize our rights, we must imitate the example of our fathers. The cause in which we are engaged in is not unlike that which engaged the attention of the people of England when they resisted the encroachments of the crown.
Yeah. And this is they talked about it a little bit in one of the previous essays we did, kind of the Cavalier versus Roundhead kind of war that continued in the New World. But like even the Jeb, one of the Jeb Stuart biographies I have is called Jeb Stuart, The Last Cavalier. I mean, it's just something that's deeply rooted in this Cavalier, anti-Roundhead, anti-Puritan, anti-centralization South. And I do believe that the Southerners of that era, they were self-aware that they were absolutely continuing the same conflict that their fathers fought on the continent.
Well, it was incredibly, we like to think of the English Civil Wars and before then as being so distant away, but it's pretty much equidistant from now to the American Civil War as it was to the American Civil War to the English Civil War. So they're very keenly aware of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and those are always really interesting quotes between the way that the Southern patriots recognize themselves as in a second Revolutionary War. And the irony just went right over the head of the Northerners, it appears.
Of course, and the idea now, if you brought that up now, would almost be just, you couldn't even talk about that because it was like, no, it couldn't be anything like that. It's just freedom versus slavery. It had nothing to do with the American Civil War, or nothing to do with American independence.
Yeah. Yeah. The slavery, I'm excited to talk about slavery a little bit.
Yeah, I am too, because
as we get a little bit deeper in this essay, because it is. Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah, it's very important. And it's also important, the historic Southern relationship to slavery, I think, is extremely important too. That gets missed a lot in the kind of the debates between North and South, who is right, who is wrong. The relationship historically between even the Southern founding fathers to slavery was very different than the Northerners. And then in the Civil War, I'm trying to say this in a way that doesn't sound completely libtarded. But like, it is somewhat true, right? When the super low IQ Southern defenders, right, when they make the argument that the North were the real racist, there is actually some truth to that. It's super libtarded because, like, obviously that's gay, but we're the real racists.
Oh yeah,
there's not a good way to say that, but
you're exactly right. Though I remember, I think at the time when secession happened, General Sherman was working at a military academy in Louisiana, and I remember him talking to the governor of Louisiana then, talking about how he strongly admired the way the governor treated the blacks and that he would support him in their, like, getting them back to Africa, but he just couldn't stand their rebellion or something. So the idea that Sherman was some kind of brave defender of Marxist values or something is just hilarious.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, well, Sherman is I might get hanged for saying this, but I sort of have a little bit of grudging respect for Sherman, just for the aspect that he understood how terrible the war was going to be from the beginning, and he was like, "Look, this is going to be total war, and we're going to have to, do some horrible stuff to win it." And he ended up being right, and then he did a lot of the horrible stuff. But I sort of have some respect for him for that, like for being realistic about it from the beginning, when a lot of other people were like,
Yeah.
this is going to be over in 3 months or whatever.
You can say a lot about Sherman, but he stood on.
Well, at the risk of this becoming like a Sherman apologizing podcast, there is something to say about Sherman in that he actually admired the Southern way of life. He wrote that, but he just couldn't stand treason. So in that regard, he's kind of similar to Andrew Jackson's position on secession.
Yeah. So,
and
we talked about slavery a minute ago. In the next paragraph, he says, he's talking about the newly liberated slaves after the war. For 10 years in the South, already ruined by the loss of nearly $2 billion invested in slaves, with its lands worthless, its cattle and stock gone, its houses burned, was turned over to the 3 millions of former slaves, some of whom could still remember the taste of human flesh, and the bulk of them hardly 3 generations removed from cannibalism. These half-savage blacks were armed. Their passions were roused against their former masters by savage political leaders like Thaddeus Stevens, who advocated the confiscation of all Southern lands for the benefit of the Negroes and the extermination, if need be, of the Southern white population. And like Charles Sumner, whose chief regret had been that his skin, was not black. So that kind of goes back to what a lot of these people were thinking before the war, is that some of them were in favor of emancipation, but only on the condition of deporting the former slaves. And it was for this reason. It was like, well, if these people are not brought into a condition where they can be productive members of society first, then they're some of them are second generation out of Africa, right? Like they don't know our way of life, and they're not acculturated to it. Is that a word?
But sounded good.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's another thing that comes up, or that doesn't come up, is that people are very aware of what just happened in Haiti and Santo Domingo, which is what Owsley talks about, is that they really, once they were freed, they just killed every white person they could find.
Yeah. So when, we don't like to hear this stuff, like modern people don't like, us anti-racist moderns don't like to hear this stuff about how peoples are a certain way. But, these people had a direct example of that in Haiti. And then a smaller one closer to home in Virginia in Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. They had examples of this. Like, this is what happens when the slaves get fired up by the Northern abolitionists and escape. They just brutally murder people until they're stopped.
And exactly what you just said there is the biggest key, especially for after the war, is that fired up by the abolitionists. And that's what kind of led to Nathaniel Bedford Forrest's first KKK, which was very different from the second and third, which were the more cartoonish Klans that we see, is that they saw that the Freedmen's Bureau was basically coming to the South and arming these freedmen and telling them, we're going to give you military weapons, and we're going to train you, and then we want you to attack Southern white men, take their property, and kill them.
Yep. Yeah. And on the, he talks about a bit that this goes back to the founding fathers and the conditions on which, like you guys said, that they could be emancipated. And we always emancipate to the West Indies or Africa, but nobody really ever produces quotes for that. But Jefferson does actually say in the Notes on the State of Virginia, he says, quote, "It will probably be asked, why not retain and incorporate the blacks into the state and thus save the expense of supplying by importation of white settlers the vacancies they will leave. Deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, new provocations, the real distinctions which nature hath made, and many other circumstances will divide us into parties and produce convulsions, which will probably never end but in the extermination of one or the other race. So yeah, the founding fathers knew that this was going to turn into a race war when you had, in some places 50% Negro, 50% whites, like it was in Florida. It was going to devolve into a race war. I don't think that they knew that it would be instigated and funded by white Northeasterners.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it kind of goes to your point about the, like the race was actually a very kind of important factor in this, that a lot of Southern apologists even try to kind of be wholesome Chungus, like anti-racist is about, but it was true. I mean, when you get into like the tariff abominations and the nullification crisis, the tariff was so bad that the South Carolina actually had more blacks than it did at whites at one point, and there was a genuine fear that could happen, like their revolt could happen and they could just start killing the whites in South Carolina, which really fueled the fear. Like, we need to get out.
And then Jason, you did almost probably a good, half an episode, maybe a whole episode dedicated to Nat Turner's rebellion.
Yeah. That was absolutely brutal. It's like, and part of it was, Nat Turner was, I don't think people know him for this really, but he was like this mystic figure almost. He had this like some kind of weird mishmash of like the Methodism / baptism or whatever else was, whatever other denominations existed in that area at the time, kind of a mishmash of that plus some sort of liberation theology plus some kind of African paganism that was handed down to him, to form this like mystical figure almost, who was one of these like charismatic preacher types. You know what I mean? Like, the type in the black church that is animated and like, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
He was kind of one of those guys almost, and like got a bunch of people fired up, and they just went on this murderous rampage throughout Southampton County in Virginia. And we have his whole story written down. There's a guy named Thomas Gray who sat down with him in his prison cell before he was executed and took down his whole story, and you can read it. And it's chilling to read, honestly. Like, you hear him talk about, basically believing himself to be chosen by God to lead this revolt. And it's wild stuff.
I mean, the same probably goes to John Brown. It's another really brutal period of American history that's kind of glossed over in our textbooks, that we kind of get taught, well, it may have been brutal, but it was necessary for the cleansing of our Southern sins, is what we were kind of taught as kids.
Yeah, that's what I was taught about John Brown as a kid. I grew up in Kansas. Where he spent a lot of time. Well, actually not that much time, surprisingly, but he spent some time. That's where he got famous. But yeah, that's the story I was told about him as a kid in school. Yeah. Like it's kind of, at least at the time I was growing up, it was kind of left open to you as a question. Like, here's the stuff he did. Here's what he was fighting for, and discuss whether he was justified or not. That kind of thing.
See, that's even better what we had. Ours, and surprisingly, even in Texas, it was more like, John Brown was a very like brutal man who like did what he did to save common decency in America or something like that. Like, it was really kind of just like a footnote that was maybe half a class period, and then just never talked about again.
Yeah. Well, anybody who's interested in that can go listen to my other podcast, which I've talked about this topic for like 50 hours. So go listen to that. Anyway.
Continue. Yeah, I definitely need to, because Just talking about it now, I read it now in a lot of these essays and the research that I do myself, and I really, every time I read it, I just find something else that's just jaw-droppingly awful.
Yeah. So
yeah, we were talking
sorry, go ahead.
about Jason and I were talking about before this and Missouri were just a micro of the war. So it is actually a really important thing for those interested in this topic to know about. Because it was just a hyper distilled microcosm.
Yeah, exactly.
Almost like an experiment leading up to the war.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Actually, it's just kind of like testing the grounds for conflict and violence, and basically for the expansion west. Is that expansion west is who controls Congress, and that was the all important question for the northern industrialists.
Yeah. Well, and it was also testing Northeastern agitation as a strategy.
Yes.
Because that's what was happening in Kansas is that there was a company called the Immigrant Aid Society in Massachusetts that was started by a guy named Eli Thayer. And its purpose was to send radical abolitionist New Englanders out to Kansas to settle it and become the political elite out there. And they were pretty successful at it, which is a big part of why Kansas became a free state in the end and ended up pushing the pro-slavery Missourians out. So that's, I mean, it was kind of a test run for a lot of the leftist political strategies that you see for, throughout even the 20th century. Like have a vanguard that goes and does this agitation. They'll provoke violence from the other side, which these guys did. Make the other side look like the bad guys, and then you win politically. So yeah,
and making the other side look like. I would wonder too. I don't know if there's any evidence for this, but I would wonder if they didn't really instigate the Kansas-Missouri border wars to sort of prime the Northeastern populace against slavery and against slave states and the South in general. So that way, when the war was actually declared, the population was ready for it and was rearing for it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and that was the exact plan. And they, like the Free Soilers, when they went there, and then they would report about this, the horrible bleeding Kansas stuff, and then they would be right there to be sent to the New England newspapers. And then Owsley talked about it, how decades before the war, New Englanders were kind of sympathetic to the South more as victims of having the slaves than actually being perpetrators. And then they read this stuff in the newspapers about horrible brutality. And you're right, it radicalizes them against the South. Like, this is horrible. This must be stopped at all costs.
Yeah. All right. So continuing on with paragraph 2, Owsley says, quote, after the South had been conquered by war and humiliated and impoverished by peace, there appeared still to remain something which made the South different, something intangible, incomprehensible in the realm of the spirit. That too must be invaded and destroyed. So there commenced a second war of conquest. The conquest of the Southern mind, calculate Northern way of life and thought upon the South, write air across the pages of Southern history, which were out of keeping with the Northern legend, and set the rising and unborn generations upon the stools of everlasting repentance. So while we're talking about kind of Kansas, Missouri, and the North and South different culturally, he talks about here, he says the out of keeping with the Northern legend. And we talked about it a bit in the last episode, kind of on folk art and folk history and whatnot. But what kind of myth and legends did the North have, believe, didn't assent to, or just outright opposed with their own myths and their own history and traditions? Like, was there a unified American people prior to Lincoln's War that shared all the same myths and legends and traditions and whatnot?
I don't think there was really. I think after the war, we kind of got saddled with the mythology of the Pilgrims, for example. You know, like the Thanksgiving story, or the even the Revolution stuff. Like, you know, when we hear about the Revolution, it's mostly centered on Boston and Philadelphia, right?
Yeah.
But like, there was a whole other war going on in the Carolinas.
Yeah, this is where Swamp Fox comes from.
Yeah.
That was something. Like, I'm Brigadier General Richard Richardson from South Carolina, who is a militia leader there, and his wife was the one that Warren Swamp Fox married about Tarleton when he was planting his trap to catch him. And that's something that you just don't hear about. And this is what the Patriot's based on. Like, Mel Gibson's Patriot is based on the Revolutionary War in South Carolina and what was going on at the time.
Yeah, which is a big reason to love that movie.
And we don't hear about it in schools very often.
No, you're right. We never hear anything in schools about it. You're like, just come to think of it, y'all were talking, and I was just thinking, I've really never heard a single thing about the South during the war. It's all about Boston Patriots, Sam Adams, you know, Lexington and Concord, Paul Revere, and then victory.
Yeah. They're forced to give a nod of the head to Washington as a Virginian, but that's about they kind of have to.
Mm-hmm.
And even then, they remade Washington in the image of the North.
Well, yeah, even then, nobody talks about him as a Virginian. He's like the first president of the United States under the Constitution.
After the war, they stole, and one of the. What was that?
Go ahead. I think one of us has some real bad lag going on.
I'm
not sure who it is.
I heard you pick up at the Constitution.
Yeah, I was talking about how nobody really thinks of Washington as a Virginian. They think about him as the first president of the United States under the Constitution.
Yes. Yeah, and that was what I was saying with after the war, the North actually basically stole Arlington from the Lee family, right? Because Mary Lee, Robert E. Lee's wife, was descended from Washington, and Arlington had been passed down to her, and that was where Robert E. Lee and her, that was their home. And after the war, the North stole it from them, and one of the arguments that they used to refuse to give it back to them was that Washington was the first president of the United States, and they felt like Washington would not want his house to be in the hands of rebels.
That's ironic.
Yeah. And it ended up reverting back to the Lee family after many years. But for a while, that was what the U.S. government was claiming. Why they wouldn't give it back to them was because Washington was the first president of the United States, and he would not agree with the Southern cause.
Well, even the larger point of the founding fathers, that a lot of Virginians, you know, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, are kind of just lumped in. You're right, with the North.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't ever hear about these people as Virginians. And I think this is something that's really true about, like, Jefferson, who was really unconcerned with any other state other than his own. He talked about all the time in his writings where he says, oh yeah, you know, Rhode Island or Connecticut or New York, they're doing this thing. Anyways, here's what Virginia is doing. And he just doesn't care about what the other states are up to, what they're doing politically. He has no care in the world for them. And yet he is touted as being a founding father of the United States and writing the founding documents and being in support of all of the post 1865 federal government.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you're right that a lot of this national mythology that we know today is post Civil War stuff. Not necessarily like whole cloth creations. Like there's some truth to it, but the application of it to the nation as a whole is kind of a post Civil War thing, I think.
Yeah, and Owsley says on page 65 of my copy, he says, quote, Northern histories, despite the frantic protest of local patriotic organizations, were almost universally taught in Southern high schools and colleges. Books that were built around the Northern legend and either completely ignored the South or insisted upon the unrighteousness of most of its history and its philosophy of life. One would judge from the average history text and the recitations conducted by the Northern schoolmarm that the Puritans and Pilgrim Fathers were the ancestors of every self-respecting American. Southern children spoke of our Puritan fathers. No child ever heard of the Southern Puritan Fathers, the great horde of Scotch-Irish Presbyterians and German Lutherans, and other strict and puritanical peoples who had pushed to the Mississippi River and far north of the Ohio before the New England population had got 100 miles west of Boston.
Yeah.
And that's that part about pushing north of the Ohio River. I think that's something that a lot of people forget about, which is somewhat unrelated. But Virginia alone, only Virginians and the state of Virginia conquered the Midwestern territories, Ohio, Indiana. Virginia went and fought the crown and won those territories and then willingly handed them over to the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually, I went to law school in Indiana, and I knew a guy there, and he was telling us that, obviously they were in the North during the Civil War, but all of their family had, like Southern Confederate stuff in their house, because when the war happened, the Northerners came and the Union came and basically confiscated all of their cattle and any just wildlife in general, and just took them away. And because they were worried that the agrarian nature of Indiana would kind of lend them to be more sympathetic to the South. And when the South came and took that area back, they handed the property back to the Hoosiers. And they're always more sympathetic to the Southerners for that reason. And it really kind of shows the agrarian versus industrialist divide.
Yeah. And there was a, I can't remember the name of the prison camp, but there was a Yankee prison camp in Indiana that in like 1870-ish, the Daughters of Confederate Veterans paid to build a monument to the Union colonel that was in charge of the prison camp because they treated the rebels so well there. Yeah, it was in Elizabeth Warren Davis talks about it in her Real History of the Ku Klux Klan.
Interesting.
Yeah, that was a very interesting anecdote.
Going back to what you were saying about the Owsley, the phrase or the paragraph where he was talking about the Northern philosophy taught in the Southern textbooks. And I was reading this, and I remember actually even saying to my wife, I was like, this is so obvious, but I never realized this before. Even in Texas, we were taught that we were descended from the Pilgrims. I can't believe it took me until now to realize how obviously not true that was.
Yeah.
Like 90% of us are even German immigrants, so obviously we're not descended from the Pilgrims. I mean, I'm Anglo, but like it just made no sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even if Southerners are, loosely related to the Pilgrims and to New Englanders, by the time they migrated south, they were a fundamentally different people. You may have had some kind of blood relation to them, but you weren't a New England Puritan if you went to Texas or you went to Georgia or something.
And even within the North, there were still some agrarians there that were living for a while until really industry took off, and then the agrarians got kind of replaced by the European immigrants to the big cities.
Yeah. And this was something that was always of concern. And Owsley has a quote in here. He kind of talks about the Southern ideal. I can't remember. Yeah, so, quote, the system of society which developed in the South then was close to the soil. It might be organized about the plantation with its wide fields and its slaves and self-sufficiency, or it might center around a small farm ranging from a 50-acre to a 100-acre tract tilled by the owner, undriven by competition, supplied with corn by his own toil, and with meat from his own pen or from the fields and forest. The amusements might be the fine balls and house parties of the planter, or the 3-day breakdown dances which David Crockett loved, or the horse races, foot races, cock and dog fights, boxing, wrestling, shooting, fighting, log rolling, house raising, or corn shucking. It might be crude or genteel, but it everywhere was fundamentally alike and natural. The houses were homes where families lived sufficient and complete within themselves, working together and fighting together. And when death came, they were buried in their own lonely, peaceful graveyards to await doomsday together. And I think that gets at the heart of the difference in the philosophies of life that Owsley was talking about in the previous quote. There's another quote in here where he talks about Jefferson's ideal of what America would be. It would be just an entire continent of farms. It would take 1,000 generations to fill, Owsley says.
Mm-hmm.
And the Southerners were deeply concerned about industrialization and about becoming a merchant class well prior to the war. Jefferson even promotes giving up our seaboard entirely. Says we should just give up the seaboard. Like the benefits do not outweigh the cost of being near a merchant class and the wars that could be had from being on the sea. It's just not worth it. Give it up. But revolutionary and shocking to most Americans, and really probably to any people. But Plato said the same thing. Plato said we should not be near the ocean at all. We can have a little bit of access to it, but we do not want merchants near us. We don't want sailors. We don't want these people anywhere near our population because they corrupt us. They have a different way of life. We don't want them. And you're inherently rootless, because if you're an actual merchant, you're just on a ship constantly going anywhere, right? You're having sex with like Vietnamese people and having Vietnamese babies while you're back in Rhode Island or something.
Yeah.
But
yellow fever.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, it's true. You're going around, you're planting babies in other places. You have like people all across the world that you know, but then you come home and you don't really have anything. If you have a family, it's probably broken. You don't have a permanent home. And that's kind of the lot of the merchant class of people. And then if you do happen to not be an actual merchant on a ship, you're still a part of the managerial class where you're not connected to the land or your people in any way, because your people are these merchants and bankers that themselves are mostly immigrants, or they're traveling constantly. There's nothing tying you to anything. And that's the fundamental different way of life between the rootedness of the South and the uprootedness of the North, and specifically New England.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And actually, I never knew that thing about Jefferson, which really makes the kind of rootless, money-obsessed nature of the North that more startling, because most, I'd say 99% of people don't even know that the first people to actually propose secession were Northerners.
Yes.
Early
Yep.
into the Republic, because they were worried about the shipping lanes that the South had from the Mississippi. Like, they were so obsessed with the merchantability of the seaboard that they were willing to secede.
Yeah, and I can't remember. Jeff Davis talks about it in Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government. I can't remember the exact number of years it was. I believe it was less than a decade after the ratification of the Constitution that Boston and New York threatened to secede.
Yes, it was really early.
Yeah, it was super early.
And then they did it again.
I think Fleming talks about that in I don't know if you guys have read what's that book called? It's going to slip my mind now. Thomas Fleming, Disease in the Public Mind. There we go.
Is that the same? Is that the same Fleming that Owsley references?
No, this is a much more recent guy.
Oh, okay. All right. Never mind. Sorry.
But yeah, there's a book called A Disease in the Public Mind, and he talks about that secession movement in the Northeast. But he's talking more generally about the development of the conflict over slavery, and he talks about a lot of this stuff too.
Yeah.
Very good book, though.
And they didn't only threaten to secede early on. They threatened to secede at the Mexican-American Wars. They threatened to secede at the War of 1812. They threatened to secede when the United States wanted to go to war with England on the Canadian border. They threatened to secede. There was multiple times that Jeff Davis lists. They're like, the North threatened to secede more times than the South ever did. The only comparable threat that the South ever issued was nullification. And that wasn't anything like the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. Wow.
Yeah, and it proves the point that the South was legally justified constitutionally for secession. Absolutely legally justified.
Yeah, and that's the biggest point that whenever I talk to people about the Civil War, is I try to get them to understand is I don't even care if they believe the South was legally justified or not. I just want them to understand that it was a legal argument or a philosophical argument, not that it was this kind of freedom slavery nonsense, but it did really have to do with law and interpretation of the Constitution and the Voluntary Compact.
Yep. And this is something that Dabney, he actually criticizes the Southern politicians on this. He criticizes them for being too focused on the constitutional aspect of it. And he says that the South should have entered into the moral arena with the Northern politicians, and they should have fought them on their own grounds and just completely wrecked the obviously fallacious and incorrect arguments that slavery is unbiblical, it's unchristian, it's immoral. Because the Southern politicians they truly believed that the Northern politicians cared enough about the Constitution to put all other issues aside and make sure that constitutional law was upheld, which they obviously didn't. So that's a criticism that Dabney makes, is that the Northern politicians were just never going to care about the Constitution, and it was fruitless to argue with them about that part. And they should have won the public mind in the moral and ethical sphere, which is interesting.
What's really interesting is how Owsley treats that as well. As he was talking about that exact same thing, as using kind of the Bible to justify slavery, which, the South was, I guess I never even realized this. You kind of take it for granted as the South being the Bible Belt, is that it was very, Jeffersonian and deist at the time, and the North was more religious. And then it kind of flipped that, the puritanical abolitionists were so focused on abolitionism, and they realized that the Bible doesn't support their positions. They just kind of reject it outright. So they just kind of revert to deism.
Well, this is I think there were biblical arguments on both sides about this. I talked a little bit about this in my other podcast, but and it's actually a point that sort of cuts against Protestantism and sola scriptura, if you think about it, because there were people on both sides making biblical arguments both for and against slavery, and then you get the situation where everybody believes in sola scriptura because they're all some form of Protestant or other, and so they would go back to that, and then a lot of people also believe in the perspicuity of Scripture. Mm-hmm. Which means that it's clear and obvious, like the meaning is clear and obvious to everybody who wants to look. And so it becomes that if somebody else is wrong, like comes to the wrong conclusion on such an important thing as slavery, they can't just be honestly mistaken. They also have to be evil, because they couldn't just be honestly mistaken, because it's so clear and obvious to everybody, right? Mm-hmm. But there's a book called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis by Mark Knoll, which is kind of goes through a lot of these arguments. The arguments that the clergy, especially the clergy in both North and South, were making at the time. But that's pretty interesting. But I just wanted to point out that people were making that argument. Like, I don't know about the politicians. I think, Southern politicians were probably more interested in the constitutional stuff. But those arguments were being made for sure.
Yeah. And also as a side note to that, the slavery question is where a lot of Protestant denominational breaks came from. Like the Southern and the Northern Baptist broke on the slavery issue. The Presbyterian Church of America and the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America broke on the slavery issue. So it wasn't even just like the Anglicans were fighting with the Northern Puritans. This is like the Baptists are fighting with the Baptists on the exact same issue, and they're breaking over this.
Yeah.
What's interesting about that, going kind of deeper into the religious question, is that as Catholics weren't really obviously a major player back then, but the Pope, he didn't quite outright support the Confederacy, but he had a lot of correspondence with Jefferson Davis through the Archbishop of New Orleans, and actually revered the South as a very religious and traditional society.
Yep. And I've heard, I don't know if this holds any weight or not, but I have heard rumors that Jeff Davis was considering converting to Catholicism before he died.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. I don't know how true that is. I don't know where the legend comes from, but I have heard a legend that he was considering conversion, seriously considering it. He was already Anglican, and the South during that time was very high church, almost indistinguishable from like the Anglican ordinariate in the Catholic Church. But yeah, he was considering just full blown becoming Catholic.
You know who did convert to Catholicism before they died?
Who?
Bill Quantrill.
Really?
Really?
Yeah.
That's
he was
fascinating.
Right at the end of the war, he fled Missouri and ended up in Kentucky, where he kept doing his bushwhacking thing. He got shot in the spine and paralyzed during a raid. And he lingered for like a month after that in prison. He was captured, of course, because he was paralyzed.
Mm-hmm.
But he lingered for like a month after that before he died. And during that time, he was baptized Catholic.
No way.
Yeah.
Do y'all know that technically the first shot of the Civil War was fired by an Orthodox Christian?
What?
Really?
Technically it was. So the governor of South Carolina, he used to be the ambassador to Russia. And so I'm not sure if his wife was Russian or they had a daughter, and then she was baptized in the Russian Orthodox Church and was raised there for a little bit. And when the Fort Sumter deal came around, they went to go, fire upon the fort, and they let the governor's daughter, she's grown up at the time, and they let her light the first cannon.
Wow.
And she was Orthodox.
Really?
That's crazy.
That's fascinating. I saw someone, I think it was Wolliver, posted something about some random Slavic brigade that fought for the Confederacy.
Wow.
I think it was Wolliver. Eventually we should do an episode about that, because they would obviously probably all be Orthodox.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
That is really interesting. A lot of
going back to the Catholic thing.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, my connection's breaking up.
Nothing. I was just saying.
Okay. Oh yeah. Going back to that Catholic thing a bit. The most prominent chaplain of the original Klan was Father Abram Joseph Ryan, who wrote the Concord Banner poem after the General Lee surrendered Appomattox, and he was actually a Catholic. And then the second most prominent chaplain was Episcopalian or Anglican. But yeah, so this idea that the South was like hyper progressive in its religion was just, I find it to be somewhat of a modern fiction. It is true that the South had a lot of thinkers that were progressive religiously, like Thomas Jefferson, obviously. But I think as a whole, they were deeply conservative in traditional in their Christianity.
Yeah, you think Owsley's wrong about that, to say that they were like Jeffersonian deists.
I do. As a whole, yeah. I mean, I don't see this is so for all the ortho bros out there, I don't care about Freemasonry that much. It doesn't matter to me. I don't think that it's like some satanic thing. At least not on America, not on the North America, and probably not anymore, even in like the whatever, like the Scottish Lodge or whatever the high lodges are. So I think you have to accept a certain narrative that like, oh, Washington was a Freemason. He was obviously some kind of weird deist guy. People at their what they confessed their entire life and where they were buried is more of a marker of their lowercase o orthodoxy than any kind of private confessions they may have held. And I think that as a whole, the Southern politicians were generally Anglican or Episcopalian after the Revolutionary War, and they were probably deeply conservative religiously. I mean, even Jefferson was buried in an Anglican cemetery, and he was an altar boy growing up. So whether or not that kind of overshadows his, perhaps he wasn't even a deist. At worst, he was a Unitarian. He wasn't a deist. So I think there's a lot of presuppositions there that are wrong. And I don't think the South was quite as deist as people would try to make it seem.
Well, the South also, I know North Carolina for a fact, maybe South Carolina too. This kind of goes into a lot of constitutional law, and so I don't want to get too bogged down with that, but they actually had established state religions at that point early in the American Republic, because the First Amendment wasn't incorporated to the states yet, or really should it ever have been, that they established Anglican as like the official state religion, and they had other laws around there, like to be qualified for this federal position, you had to confess this confession, or they were very conservative in that regard.
Now, I could be mistaken. I thought that some states retained the state religion after the First Amendment was ratified.
Yes. So yeah, they did it all the way. I think the last one to disestablish was maybe Massachusetts or New Hampshire.
Oh, okay.
Or Connecticut. It was like in the 1840s, and it was willingly. So how the First Amendment works, or how really the whole entire Bill of Rights work, is it doesn't apply to the states at all,
right,
until incorporation after the 14th Amendment. So at that time, the federal government couldn't establish a state religion, but each state could.
Yeah, and that was how I understood it.
Yeah, and justices like Clarence Thomas and even myself, I agree that I think incorporation really was not proper of the Establishment Clause to the states, is that really that was the original intent, to allow the different states to choose for themselves.
Yeah. And this was...
Well, that's like the difference between, we've talked about this before, like the difference between state self-governance and like radical individual do whatever the hell you want freedom, right? Mm-hmm. So like there's definitely a difference there where individual states choosing a state religion for themselves is one thing, and then just having a total free-for-all is a completely different thing.
Yeah, and this is Jeff Davis talks about it in The Rise and Fall when he talks about the phrase "we the people" from the preamble. And he said, so the original draft of the Constitution, it actually listed, it didn't say "we the people." They found it later on when the documents were turned over to the State Department. And it listed "we the people of," and then each individual colony was listed. The reason why that list of colonies was taken out and replaced with "we the people" was because they weren't sure how many states were going to ratify, like North Carolina and Rhode Island didn't ratify. So it would have been, fruitless to put them on the list because it didn't apply to them. So it was changed for "we the people." And Jeff Davis makes the argument that it was only done with the understanding that the context is not "we the people" as one aggregate United States sort of national citizenry made up of individuals, but it's "we the people of the states" through our delegates. And some would argue that it's probably semantics, but it isn't, because it's radically different to say that every individual in the United States submitted to the Constitution versus the state sent delegates to go decide whether or not the Constitution will be ratified in their state.
Yeah, to represent their state's interest. It's kind of like the difference between the original Senate versus what we have now. Like the senators used to be elected by the state legislatures, and they were representatives of their state rather than being directly elected by the people of the state.
Yeah, it's exactly the it's a very big difference, and it may not seem like a big difference, is that we used to call it, the United States with a lowercase u, like the United States. Now it's just one unit. United States is just the name. Whereas there actually was seen as United Group of States. Yeah.
And Patrick Henry, he said that it was that phrase was the linchpin that the American experiment would fail or succeed on. If we, the people of the United States, meant one aggregate national citizenry, the United States would fail. If it meant we, the people of the states, represented, he said it would succeed. And Mr. Madison had to refute Patrick Henry's argument in order to get the Constitution ratified to begin with, because everybody was so against this aggregate United States made up of individuals that sort of superseded their respective states. Everybody hated this.
Yeah.
Probably with the exception of Hamilton.
So,
what were you going to say, Marco?
No, I was going to take us down a different rabbit hole. If you
go for it.
All right. I was about to say that, this kind of ties in to really a lot. This flag gets memes now for being libertarian, but that's originally what the Gadsden flag was for, is that the snake was to symbolize the snake from Benjamin Franklin's Join or Die. The Union of States, all tied together as a union of states. And so the snake was seen as like the union of states, and became a fundamentally American thing, not for individual do whatever the hell you want without the government, libertarian thing that it is now today. But and actually what's interesting about that flag is that it was used so often by the South during the Civil War that I think it was Lincoln or said that the flag had been so tainted with like the Southern stench or something that it could never be used again by the Union, which is interesting.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Because Gadsden was from South Carolina, actually.
Really?
Yep.
Huh. I had no idea. That's interesting. Yeah, continuing on that, some of the flags the South had during the war were they were badass. I mean, they were really just top tier flags.
Oh, I love looking at flags from different areas, like the United States history, like the Civil War, the Texas War, the Revolution. Also, like, I love looking at those flags.
Man, I think that the best place to get flags from is probably Gettysburg Flags from Virginia. They make some high quality flags, and they have so many flags that you just wouldn't hear about at all, and they sell them. It's great. If anybody's looking for you got. I fly a Bonnie Blue from Gettysburg, and it's made with cotton grown in Virginia. Everything is sewed. It's awesome.
That's really cool.
Yeah, definitely look them up, because they've got some really, like, they even have what was supposedly Quantrill's band. They had apparently a flag, just a black flag, and according to Gettysburg Flags, they had stitched Quantrill on it, and they sell that flag.
Yeah, that's pretty sweet.
Yeah,
I know a guy from South Carolina. He's so racistly and proudly Southern that he hates Scots still, and even Scotch Americans, that he refuses to like fly the battle flag because it has the Scottish
St. Andrew's cross.
So he always flies the Polk flag because it's St. George's.
Oh wow. Polk gets a lot of hate. I think unjustly. I don't think he was that bad.
I actually don't know enough about him. I know the actual Polk on Substack posts a long thing about him. I actually need to read it. I don't know really much about him at all.
Well, do you know how he died?
No, not at all.
Oh man, I forget where it was. It was somewhere in Kentucky or no, Tennessee or somewhere in the Western Theater. I forget where exactly. But he got sniped from like an adjacent hilltop by a cannon.
Oh,
Like I forget who the Union officer was that decided to do this, but he was like on top of a hill, scoping out the enemy positions, and the artillery just started taking pot shots at him and cut him in half with a cannonball.
Oh my
oh
goodness.
man.
Yeah, it was brutal.
He was a bishop in the Anglican Church.
Yep.
Whoa, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, he was
I
a bishop,
forget
and
about
he didn't even give up. He didn't give up his bishopric. But he didn't. I don't think he entered the Confederate Army as a chaplain. I think he entered as a full blown like soldier, and then he ended up getting promoted or whatnot. I think someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he had a personal relationship with Jeff Davis that earned him a commission, but it wasn't as a chaplain. I don't think.
That is something interesting about the Civil War is how there were a good amount of people, I don't know about the North, but at least in the South, who, enlisted as privates and then they became generals by the end of the war. It's a pretty interesting fact. Like
Forrest.
Nathan Bedford Forrest, yeah.
Yeah, famously. He was a private, promoted all the way to what? He didn't get a lieutenant generalship. But I think he ended as a brigadier, right?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. I know at least general.
Yeah.
I think Cleburne too.
Oh, really?
I'm actually not 100% sure about that.
They were a different breed back then. I found out couple months ago the youngest general in the Confederate Army was 23.
Jeez, man.
We're a different breed of people.
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous. I mean, all these guys were young. I think Jeb Stuart he was younger than 30 when he got killed.
Yeah. Yeah, the Missouri bushwhackers were like teenagers, a lot of them.
Oh man. We can't even imagine that today.
No, not at all.
Quantrill was ancient for a bushwhacker, and he was, I think, 26 when he died in 1865.
Ancient, man.
Yeah.
Wow. All right. So going back to the essay, we were talking about earlier with the Kansas-Missouri border wars and what the Kansas-Nebraska Act kind of meant for the broader political interests. And so the first paragraph of chapter 4, Owsley says, quote, "This agrarian society had its own interests, which in almost all respects diverged from the interests of the industrial system of the North. The two sections, North and South, had entered the revolution against the mother country with the full knowledge of the opposing interest of their societies. Knowing this difference, they had combined in a loose union under the Articles of Confederation. Finally, they had joined together under the Constitution, fully conscious that there were thus united two divergent economic and social systems, two civilizations, in fact. The two sections were evenly balanced in population and in the number of states, so that at the time there was no danger of either sections encroaching upon the interest of the other. This balance was clearly understood. Without it, a union would not have been possible. Even with the understanding that the two sections would continue to hold this even balance, the sections were very careful to define and limit the powers of the federal government, lest one section with its peculiar interests should get in control of the national government and use the powers of that government to exploit the other section. Specific powers were granted the federal government, and all not specifically granted were retained by the states." And then the first sentence of the next paragraph says, "But equilibrium was impossible under expansion and growth." End quote.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what the Kansas conflict was about.
And this is also what like the Mexican-American War, the threat of secession of the North was about. Even earlier was they thought that the slave states were going to like conquer more territory and institute slavery and for some reason take over the federal government. I think there is probably a valid argument that says that equilibrium would have been impossible to maintain in a growing country.
Mhm.
But I think it's Owsley talks about it a little bit further in. He says that it wasn't only to maintain equilibrium and equality between the North and the South, but between all of the states with each other. And he even goes as far as to say that it protects the states, the southern states, from one another, so that Florida and Texas interests would not be able to dominate, either, or Georgia and Alabama wouldn't have competing interests where one of them could dominate the other. And so what would have happened had like this Kansas turned out pro-slavery instead of a free state or something like that? Like what would have happened had the imbalance fallen in favor of the slave states?
Well, it's funny to think about with, the idea that the South taking over the federal government is that really taking over the federal government just essentially means doing nothing. Owsley talks about that, where the North wants proactive action for, the industry, and the South just wants a lack of action. So I think, the industrial business interests in the North, if Kansas had been, a slave state, for lack of a better word, they kind of would have been more and more pressed to be more agitating, to be more maybe aggressive, because they really, really, they're going to sound like a communist here, but industry really wants to expand and go out.
Yeah, the machine's got to eat.
Yep, exactly.
Well, and that's kind of kind of on that point that Owsley makes in here about the South wanting inaction and the North wanting action. Ultimately, It's like that's why Cthulhu always swims to the left, right? Because like they're the ones historically always pushing for more of what they want, where the conservatives, for lack of a better term, are just trying to hold what they have. And they, it's like just waves washing up on the shore. Like eventually they're gonna erode the thing. Like no matter if all you're trying to do is inaction and maintain the status quo, and the other side is like relentlessly pushing for more and more progress, like the progress is eventually going to win out.
Yeah, the Overton window is always going to shift.
Yeah.
That was something that we were talking about a little bit before, I think yesterday, that the Overton window has continued shifting to the extent where after Reconstruction's over, all of that, whatever, you really get into like World War I, and all of a sudden the South has become the upholders of the American tradition and of American conservatism, and they send the majority of the soldiers to die in the war, and the Southerners come back trying to defend American tradition. And really, by the time you get to post-World War II, the North has all but burned the American flag, and now the South are the ones left flying it. And I think that what it really shows, the Overton window shifted to where prior to Lincoln's War, the South is maintaining the early American way of life. After the war, the South maintains they still try to maintain the early American way of life, but then Reconstruction happens and it succeeds. And they maintain sort of this pseudo-American way of life, Reconstruction America, prior to like really crazy liberalization. And then in the present day, we have the South generally still upholding things like being against birthright citizenship, being in favor of closing the borders, being in favor of the Second Amendment, of the First Amendment. Whereas now the symbolic North has just thrown all that out the window and has just given up on America entirely. And it's kind of that age-old battle of conservatism and liberalism that we've been seeing since the French Revolution.
Yeah, I saw this when I went and visited the Kansas History Museum in Topeka last December. It had been renovated over the last couple of years. And, I was there a lot when I was a kid on, my parents would take me there and I'd go there on school field trips and things like that. But, I compare the story they're telling now about Kansas' role in the Civil War to what I was taught as a kid. And it's like, it's that Overton window shift. It's like, okay, now we're going to deconstruct and question all the myths that we had been telling you over the last 20 years, or like 20 years ago when you were a kid. Now we're like interrogating the myth of Kansas as a free state, because actually Northerners were racist too, don't you know? And like, and we treated the Indians really bad, and we have to talk about that and do this like struggle session kind of thing. Whereas the story I was told as a kid was like, okay, Kansas is a bastion of freedom in the West. And, we got John Brown who kind of, maybe he went a little too far, but kind of, wink, wink, he was kind of a hero. Yeah. And, it was the plucky resistance of the Kansas Free Staters fighting back against the border ruffians of Missouri. And they won out in the end through this, bloody struggle. And even though that may have been false, like, it was still respectable. You know what I mean? It was like, as a kid in Kansas who was taught Enlightenment ideals and kind of grew up with that stuff, I could feel proud of that.
Yeah.
I'm proud of my state for that. But now we're just deconstructing all that because the Overton window has shifted way further to the left. And now we're doing this whole deconstruction thing and, chastising ourselves for not being anti-racist enough in the past.
Yeah, that was, it's really obnoxious the way that they shove the anti-racist stuff in our faces. And I don't even know how they put up with it, because it really is just obnoxious. Like when we went to the Jefferson Library of Congress, there was one exhibit dedicated to Negroes in the United States, and it wasn't even only about heritage Negroes, about like Africa, and then another dedicated to Indians. Like there's just nothing about American heritage. There's nothing about the whites in America, not even about the Puritans. There's just nothing. It's all about other peoples. And it's really, I think it really shows not even the end result, because I don't know if there is a definable end result of the progressive ideology that the North has really had since the Puritans, but it's really disheartening that the progressive ideology has won out to such an extent that now our own buildings that were built by heritage Americans have been converted into just cesspools of third world apologetics.
And the same stuff was going on in Texas. I've been seeing it recently. When I was a kid, we were still mostly taught in school, of course, that the South was evil and the South was bad. But we're Texas. We're different. We're better than the South. We have our own great history. We settled the West. We were cowboys. We defeated the Comanches. And we were always taught that Stephen F. Austin hated Jefferson Davis, and he did. So we're like, we weren't really a part of them. We just had to be because we were in close proximity. But then nowadays, they're being taught in schools like, oh, well, like the Anglo-Texans, they invaded Mexico and settled there with the specific plan to secede, and they introduced slavery there. And Santa Anna wouldn't allow slavery, so they seceded. It was all about slavery. It was Texas is just as evil as the rest of them.
And what's great, Texas had a far lower percentage of slaves than any of the other southern states.
Yeah.
They
Well,
had
I probably
almost
except for
nothing.
Florida, but yeah.
Florida, no, this is something really interesting that people don't often know. Florida in like 1860 to 1863, they were 50% slaves, 50% whites.
Really, I would have thought
Yep.
nothing. Wow.
Florida in 1864, I believe it was 1864, only had 15,000 white fighting age men.
Goodness, that puts
And
into
didn't they
perspective how
didn't
many
they
fought.
send a higher percentage of their white men to war than any other southern state?
Yep, a
I
higher
feel
percentage.
like I heard that somewhere.
Yep, they sent a higher percentage of fighting age men than any other Confederate state, and they suffered the highest percentage of casualties.
Mhm.
Over 1/3 didn't even come home, and out of that third that came home, it was like only a quarter of them were unscathed from the war.
Yeah.
Yeah, Florida was completely decimated, and much like Texas, Florida really had no dog in the fight, certainly less than like Kentucky had, and yet they still fought vehemently, just like Texas did. It's like, had Texas and Florida not seceded with the Confederacy, nothing probably would have happened to them, and their way of life would have remained largely unchanged.
Mhm.
They fought just because they hated tyranny so much.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's an interesting thing people don't often think about. Florida kind of gets a bad name in the war as being so Virginians don't really like Floridians, and Virginia press would blame a lot on Floridians that didn't actually happen. Like I believe it was the second Florida was on Pickett's charge, and they lost like 80% of their men on Pickett's charge. And the Virginian press after that basically blamed the failure of Pickett's charge on the Floridians for turning around and running away.
Yeah, I think that one was more on Lee than on Pickett or the Floridians.
Yeah. Yep. Which he said about himself. So.
Yep.
But going back to the larger point that we were talking about a little bit earlier about the Overton window, is I think it's really, really easy to see now in modern America how much that kind of this leftist kind of this attitude has just wrapped around in the centers of industry. So where, like northern states, Midwest or even the West, like Montana and them, they're kind of like the South with keeping that kind of bastion of conservatism, because that, they don't have that industry there anymore. And so they're still kind of bound with the South. Whereas like the port cities or the coast, like New York, Chicago, LA, whatever, they're very, still rootless, still, anti-conservative. And I think that's kind of interesting how it's gone from a north-south thing to now just centered around the major points of the economy.
Yeah.
And obviously racially too, like, it's not completely, it's actually very tied into that.
Yeah.
We were talking about that on DMs the other day.
Mm-hmm.
Like that regional split, switching from north-south to like both are kind of spread out all over. Both ideologies are kind of spread out all over now.
Yeah. And apparently there was even some places in the North that sided with the South ideologically to the point of practically seceding. Like from what I've heard, certain counties in Southern Illinois had seceded from the state of Illinois to side with the South. So it was even true then that certain places that upheld agrarianism just sided with the South over the North, even though they were irrespective of geographical proximity.
Yeah.
And I just asked, my godfather's from Montana. I just asked him a couple weeks ago, what, I don't know what Montana people are called. Montanans, I guess. I don't know. But what those people think about the war and who is right. And he said that people from Montana identify and sympathize with the South over the North. Simply because they do live a much more agrarian philosophy than New Englanders or Californians or something.
Yeah.
Oh, I remember I was when I was in high school, I went up to Vermont for the first time in my life for a recruiting visit for baseball. And I was driving through these farms and I saw a big Confederate battle flag on like 4 farms in a row. And I was like, what in the world is this in Vermont? And so I guess it must be just the kind of the, tied to the soil kind of thing, anti big industry liberalism that you get when you kind of are tied to the soil.
Yeah.
Yeah, Vermont's kind of an oddball in New England. It's like
were they one of the slave states?
Vermont?
Yeah, were they one of the New England states that retained slavery for a while?
I don't know how long they retained it. I know all of them did at the time of the Revolution. But I don't know how long they retained it.
Okay.
New Hampshire is a really oddball because it's just the straight libertarian state.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah, so in one thing I was a little bit confused by at first in this essay was in chapter 3, he says, complex though the factors were which finally caused war, they all grew out of 2 fundamental differences which existed between the 2 sections. The North was commercial and industrial, and the South was agrarian. So that's the first one, and then he doesn't say what the second one is until like a lot closer to the end.
Yeah.
Where he starts, and the second one ends up being the slavery issue.
Yeah.
Well, I guess those are fundamentally tied together, though.
Yeah. So, okay. So actually in that quote, the end of that quote on page 70 on mine, he says, Thomas Jefferson, not visualizing the Industrial Revolution, which whipped up the multiplication of populations and tore their roots from the soil, dreamed of America, free from England, as a boundless utopia of farms, taking 1,000 generations to fill. I don't think that people quite realize just how dedicated the South was to the soil and to agrarianism. But that quote, he referred to Jefferson, and Jefferson says, quote, those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if he had a chosen people, whose breast he has made his peculiar deposit for substantial and genuine virtue. It is the focus in which he keeps alive that sacred fire which otherwise might escape from the face of the earth. Corruption of morals in the mass of cultivators is a phenomenon of which no age nor nation has furnished an example. It is the mark set on those who, not looking up to heaven, to their own soil and industry, as does the husbandman, for their subsistence, depend for it on casualties and caprice of customers. Dependence begets subservience and venality, suffocates the germ of virtue, and prepares fit tools for the designs of ambition. This, the natural progress and consequence of the arts, has sometimes perhaps been retarded by accidental circumstances, but generally speaking, the proportion which the aggregate of the other classes of citizens bears in any state to that of its husbandmen, of its unsound to its healthy parts, and is a good enough barometer whereby to measure its degree of corruption. So yeah, the South was dedicated to this idea of agrarianism, of husbandry, of not only of the planter class, but of the yeomanry, to such an extent that the South truly believed that those who till the ground and are able to be self-reliant and self-sufficient as not only as individual people, but as whole communities were literally the chosen people of God. And they viewed industrialism as the inherent enemy of God, as the seed of all immorality, the seed of living an unvirtuous life. They viewed it as the you could call it, Prometheus's fire, or the apple from the Garden of Eden. That was what they viewed industrialism as.
Or the Tower of Babel.
Yeah, the Tower of Babel.
Yep.
Any of those myths, those myths all play into the way that they viewed industrialism.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think that when Owsley talks about, he frames it that way, I think that that's kind of the heart of what he's getting at, is that the South really, they viewed themselves and agrarianism as being the height of virtue, the height of civilization. And he lists all those great civilizations, the Romans, the Greeks. And he specifically highlights the Romans as being kind of their main influence and the ideal that they held up. But yeah, that's the extent to which they were dedicated to this ideal, that they viewed the North as being inherently opposed to it.
And I think those myths, or not myths, but parallels to the ancient civilizations, are really, really pertinent, that people can kind of overlook. And especially to your point about the big cities and industry being centers of really kind of degeneracy and unrootedness, is they love the Romans more, but they specifically love the Roman Republic. And I remember when I was researching this, is that the end of the Roman Republic, it kind of culminated in a big mass move of the agrarian Romans to cities like Rome, of course, where, they'd become so powerful and so strong, and they had so many slaves and indentured servants that Rome's farmers could now just basically use indentured servants and slaves to do their farming for them. And so the idea was that, now the farmers are emancipated from their work. They don't have to work so hard, and they move to the cities, and they go to the cities, and now the cities become overcrowded and there's not enough jobs for everyone. On paper, the Republic is very rich. It's producing more for far less because now it's slaves and indentured servants doing the work. So in a modern saying, we would say, well, their GDP is rising, but their quality of life is decreasing, if that sounds familiar. And, they go to the cities, the people are unemployed, and so they don't have any purpose. So instead they look for pleasure. So the sexual degeneracy, art, civil unrest. And, the first thing that Augustus does is that he really just returns the farms back to the Romans, Roman control, and kind of gets rid of most of the indentured servants and the slaves. And then the empire, of course, was an empire and did away with a lot of the stuff that made the Republic great. But it really was this idea of being part of the soil of Rome that made them great. And then the degeneracy of the cities kind of decayed them.
Yep. And Owsley specifically references, Cincinnatus specifically. I am woefully underread on Cincinnatus, so if someone wants to give context to that, reference to him as kind of the ultimate ideal that the South loved, that would be fantastic.
Well, Cincinnatus was a guy that I forget if he was I think he was a consul at some point. I forget which time period he was in, but basically he retired and went back to his farm at the end of it, even though the Romans wanted him to keep being a general and a civic leader. He was like, no, I'm done. I'm going back to my farm. And he retired. That's why they admire him.
Okay.
Yes. Cincinnatus was the basic ideal militiaman. And then this is going to tie me back into, King Alfred and back to my long-winded Putin esque talk. But like Cincinnatus was essentially a farmer and a consul, but then, you know, in the Roman Republic times, when it was a time of emergency, they had a dictator, which was very different than what we call dictators today. Is that one person takes control because there's an emergency. And so Cincinnatus became the dictator, defeated Rome's enemies, and then there's a statue of Cincinnatus in Cincinnati, of course.
Yeah.
And it's of him handing the fasces back to the people. And so the fasces, most people know from fascism, is that, you know, bundle of sticks tied together because together is strong. And that was a symbol in the Roman Republic of when the dictator gave the fasces back to the people, that means I'm relinquishing power back to the Republic, back to the people. And so that is what Cincinnatus was really celebrated for, is that, you know, he rose up, he was a farmer, he was just a Roman man through and through. He did his civic duty. It was, I mean, the Roman Republic's army was all militia back then. It was not professional. He fought, and then when it was over, when it was unnecessary to be ruler anymore, he went back to being a farmer.
Yeah.
And then this kind of goes into the militia aspect of the Jeffersonian militia aspect, or the Hamiltonian centralized military, is that, you know, King Alfred had the militia. A lot of the more like royalist people wanted a militia. And, you know, the South also wanted the militia. Is that was the ideal, is that your yeomen, your farmers are tied to the land. And then when, you know, harm arises, invasion, Indian raids, anything like that, or insurrection, the militia comes and takes care of it. And then once the problem's solved, go back to being a farmer. And that was the ideal.
Yeah. And that, that ideal was exemplified a lot in Southern statesmen, from Washington to Thomas Jefferson, you know, both of whom just sort of retired into peace on their own plantations and almost into obscurity, really. And Jefferson, he says, quote, "Never was there so much false arithmetic employed on any subject as that which has been employed to persuade nations it is in their interest to go to war, where the money which it costs to gain at the close of the long war a little town or a little territory, the right to cut wood here or to catch fish there, expended in improving that they already possess, in making roads, opening rivers, building ports, improving the arts, and finding employment for their idle poor, it would render them much stronger, much wealthier, and happier. This, I hope, will be our wisdom, and perhaps to remove as much as possible the occasion of making war, it might be better for us to abandon the ocean altogether, that being the element whereon we shall principally be exposed to jostle with other nations, to leave to others to bring what we shall want, and to carry what we can spare. And I repeat again, cultivators of the earth are the most virtuous and independent citizens. It might be time enough to seek employment for them at sea when the land no longer offers it, but the actual habits of our countrymen attach them to commerce. They will exercise it for themselves. Wars then must sometimes be our lot, and all the wise can do will be to avoid that half of them which would be produced by our own follies and our own acts of injustice, and to make for the other half the best preparations we can." And that ties in to sort of that Cincinnatus ideal with Jefferson and other places. Also says that having a standing military is just completely pointless because of this. He doesn't believe that people should be uprooted. He doesn't believe that, you know, we should have a massive military that moves people from, you know, South Carolina to California to be stationed there. He believes in that militia ideal, that ideal that when war comes, we deal with it. Otherwise, we don't engage in warfare for economic gain. We don't engage in warfare just to do it. We do it when it comes. Otherwise, we go back to our lands and our farms, and that's how we live. And so that's a deeply rooted Southern tradition.
And I will say about that, though, it is absolutely deeply Southern. But I will say that John C. Calhoun kind of realized that the kind of only militia thing with no standing army was flawed once you start getting into great power competition. Is that when you start competing with Britain, like that War of 1812, is is that I am actually very in favor of a very strong standing army, but I really like the original Constitution point of the militia. And I think I did a seminar paper of this in my last semester in law school about how the militia has kind of like the constitutional militia has kind of completely gone away. It's almost all been professionalized. And so we kind of like, I like to have a standing army. I think it's absolutely imperative, but that militia aspect is so important that it's just completely forgotten now.
Yeah. I'm kind of up in the air on the standing military issue. Obviously, in modern America, probably necessary because we're an empire and we have to have a standing military to. I don't know. I'm kind of up in the air on that. I don't know if I want to be a great power enough to have a standing military.
Yeah. Well, I'm too retarded to even weigh in on that, but I think it's one question before you become a great power, and then it's another question once you already are.
Yeah.
So it's like, I mean, the cat. We've kind of already opened Pandora's box on that.
Yeah, that is the problem. As soon as we get rid of our standing military, somebody's going to smack us.
Yeah, I think I'm of the opinion that the standing military is absolutely necessary, whether you're not a great power, because power defines everything in the international realm, whether you're a great power, a small power. I mean, look what happened to the South, what we're just doing right now after we lost a war. So, we can these ideas of, the militia are great, and I actually do love them, but we need to have power to defend that.
Yeah. Now, this brings up something somewhat interesting that Jason and I were talking about. Jason, you had said that the South was more heavily influenced by Sparta than Athens. And like when
that's it. I don't know if I'd say I wouldn't put it that way. I would say that in the context of the Peloponnesian War specifically. Like if you want to kind of draw parallels.
Yeah,
you draw parallels between the South and Sparta and between the North and Athens. I wouldn't say I would say that the South is probably more heavily influenced by Athens ultimately because
I see.
of all the democracy stuff and like the, because Athens influences Rome and then Rome in turn influences the founding of America. So I would put it a different way.
Now, during the Peloponnesian War, was Sparta as did they have as like militant a society as they are, or as they're known for now, like the way that Plato knows them for?
Yeah, they had a pretty militant society. I mean, if you read Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, he kind of goes over the founding of that system, and it was pretty much. They were professional soldiers. They were the only professional soldiers in Greece for a couple, like hundreds of years, because they had the slave class to do their farming for them.
Right.
And they just, they spent all their time training for war. So, but yeah, they were very militant.
Okay. Yeah, that was something that I had found kind of interesting, thinking about the kind of the difference between like having a big standing military and a more of the militia type framework, was how that plays into the Spartan versus Athenian influence on the South, or the Spartan versus Athenian parallels, with Sparta being very anti that militia. Well, I don't even know necessarily anti-militia, but very pro having a large standing military always ready to fight.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of one of the things that Sparta that contributes to Sparta's decline in the end is the declining number of full Spartan citizens in their city. Like they end up having their society was kind of split into the Spartiates, which were like the full Spartan citizens that had been trained, from childhood in war. And then there were the what are they called? There's a Greek word for it that means dwellers around. The Greek word for it is slipping my mind at the moment, but they were like the sort of not slaves, but also not full Spartan citizens. And then you had the helots that were the slaves. But as time goes on, you see that that second class, the middle class, growing, and the full Spartan citizen class decreasing in numbers.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay. Yeah, I was just kind of curious about the relationship with that and the kind of the idea of like a standing military or militia framework.
Yeah, the parallels aren't perfect. Like there's some things that fit pretty well, and there's other things that don't really.
Yeah, of course.
I'm very deeply interested in this aspect of the militia in American history, and that's actually what I was planning on writing my next Substack post on. And so I have done a lot of like recent research on it, and especially for that paper I was talking about. And I know that because Thomas Jefferson was so adamant on having a militia, we have the constitutional concept of the organized militia and the unorganized militia.
Yeah.
And so what Jefferson's idea was that if we are to be defended by the militia, that every male would be trained in military, basically like go through basic training, essentially.
Yeah.
Is that he had a quote to James Monroe. It says that we must train and classify the whole of our male citizens and make military instruction a regular part of collegiate education. We can never be safe until this is done. And so Thomas Jefferson goes on to found West Point, which he was, in his imagination, would be the ideal for military academies throughout all the entire U.S. Is that every male would go to a West Point style school, learn the military history, trade craft, and of course, military training.
Yeah.
So that way we would be a very militant society. We would be, farmers, yeomen, but that we would also be ready and capable, most importantly, capable on a moment's notice to fight. So we weren't just some kind of farming society. We were also deeply militant.
Yeah. And see, now that's actually something that I very much agree with. I do think that all men ought to be trained in, I was in the military, so I in how to protect and defend their country and their homes. I probably wouldn't consider that to be a standing military, obviously.
No, it wasn't. Jefferson didn't either.
Yeah. But I do absolutely agree with that system. And I think that it spoke volumes in, of course, the South bragged famously that, 3 Yankees up to 10 Yankees were as good as 1 Southerner. And in many battlefields, it held true that Southerners just wiped the floor with Yankees.
Yeah. And, it's something my father has instilled in me since I was young. Every male in my entire family going back to the Civil War was in the military. And so my dad is very, he always is talks about how he's very German in his mindset, kind of Prussian, more or less than English, because he likes that kind of stuff. And so that idea of, being prepared, being taught in professional military education and training is absolutely imperative, not just really to national security, but also to tying yourself to patriotically and nationalistically to your land. And in the South, especially that time, that was how you entered the nobility, was military officership.
Yeah. And I don't have the actual statistics pulled up, but you get the impression reading a lot of this historical literature, the South seemed to have significantly more military institutes than the North did. And that's kind of the impression you get. Like everybody that mattered went to military institute that was Southern, not so much with the North.
Yeah, there was
Lincoln wasn't even in the military.
Yeah. Yeah, we have VMI, the Citadel. Oh, there's one other one in Virginia, and I'm forgetting. The Georgia Military College, Marion Military Institute. We have quite a bit of them.
Yeah, and a lot of the colleges that are no longer military institutes were. And a lot of, some that you don't even think about, like Texas A&M.
Yeah,
military institute. But yeah, like that, a lot of people don't think about that. Like that's a military institute.
Virginia Tech.
Yeah. But yeah, and I actually very much agree with the idea of having, and I think that might be kind of that Spartan influence that I was getting at a little bit. This idea that the whole population is trained to be the military when the time comes.
And there was actually a quote from Samuel Adams about him complaining that Boston did not turn out like that. I have it right here. He said, "I once thought that the city of Boston would be a Christian Sparta, but alas, will men never be free?"
That, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And and this goes back even to the days of the Revolutionary War with the competency of the Southerners as the Northerners. Washington did not like fighting side by side with Northerners very much. They were just incompetent. Just generally, and not just like they weren't good shots. They weren't competent in military tactics. They were generally useless on the battlefield until a little bit later in the war when they got some experience.
I know Washington also was not a big fan of the militiamen he had. He wanted a more professional military, but you have to keep in mind that was also before this kind of concept of the American professional military education for militiamen came about. So these really were just people off the farm coming with no training.
Yeah. And it does that is obviously something that made a big difference in the Southerner and the Northerner too, because not all of these, Southern privates, most of them didn't go to VMI or West Point or any military institute. But a lot of them did live on the frontier, and a lot of them had probably seen Indians.
Exactly.
And they just lived in a way that their situational awareness was always heightened. They were, if you lived on the Texas frontier, you were always worried about Comanches. That was just how it was.
This was so interesting about this. I remember studying this in one of my Second Amendment classes is that people, my mind was blown, people's minds were blown, is that actually in early America, a lot of states, especially frontier states, but even places like Boston, had laws that required you to carry a firearm. And if you didn't, you would be fined. Because they were so worried about Indian invasions or uprisings, and that you were an irresponsible person. There was a South Carolina law that if you did not carry a firearm in church, you would be jailed.
There's still, my parents live in Kennesaw, Georgia, and there's still a law there that you are not allowed to own a home unless you are a firearm owner.
Oh, wow.
Yep. You can only rent. If you're not going to own a firearm, you can only rent a house. You cannot own one.
Do they enforce that?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yep. You cannot own a home there unless you're going to be a registered firearm owner.
Wow.
And not like registered as in like they're being gay, like, oh, you have to register your guns. No, we have to have proof that you own a gun if you're going to own a house here.
Huh.
So that's kind of like a remnant of those old laws.
Yeah. That's
What's
wild.
funny is back in the old Second Amendment jurisprudence is kind of reversed to what it is now, or actually it's changed since 2022, thankfully. But of what the modern Second Amendment jurisprudence was, is back then it was like the Second Amendment protected only weapons of war because you needed them for war. And then if it wasn't a weapons for war, then it was like you could regulate it. And then kind of recently now it's like, oh, well, that's a weapon of war. Nobody needs that. So that's going to be regulated.
This is our whole system's so fucked up.
Wasn't there a big case about somebody having like privately owning artillery for their ships or something early on?
Gosh, I don't know that one, but it wouldn't surprise me.
I think I heard something about that.
I've heard so many cases,
like
Second Amendment cases.
Yeah, like merchant ships, needed cannons on board to protect themselves from pirates, and so I don't even remember anything about this case. I just remember hearing about it at some point. I don't know. I'm going to be totally talking out my ass with this, but I think I heard that the Supreme Court upheld the private right to own cannons.
Wow.
for this reason.
Well, if it's for that specifically construed reason, I could see it, because 2011 was the major year where Miller came out that changed Second Amendment law forever. But before that, it was no, that wasn't Miller. That was Heller. Miller was in the 30s, and it was a man who owned a sawed-off shotgun, and he was arguing that it was his right under the Second Amendment. And the Supreme Court held that sawed-off shotguns aren't really weapons of war, so you can't use it. Unless it's a weapon of war, then you can use it. If it has like a war purpose, then yes. But if it's only for like delinquency, then you can't. Which is funny, because then like 5 years later, 10 years earlier, they're using shotguns in the trenches in Germany. But
yeah.
But that was
Yeah,
how the law was, so I could see the canon thing if it's specifically construed for that.
Yeah, the distinction between what's a weapon of war and what isn't. Anything can be a weapon of war. Like
Yeah.
America could just go to war with like bolt action 30-06s.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I find that whole argument just ridiculous. Like,
Well,
but the Constitution doesn't matter. So
that whole argument is
that's a joke.
mostly had by people who don't know anything about guns. So
yeah.
Well, yeah, that's what's funny to me is that now it's like, whoa, it has to regulate an AR-15. That's a weapon of war. That's not for hunting. Like, well, that was never really ever the kind of test in Second Amendment jurisprudence, but for some reason states are passing those laws.
Which this is going to come as a bit of a hot take. I actually don't have an issue with states passing gun laws. I don't care that much, because I am pretty dedicated to the idea. Like, if we're actually working from a constitutional framework, I'm pretty dedicated to the idea that the states can do whatever they want and the federal government just can't intervene. And the federal government, likewise, like the state couldn't send a case to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court rule in the state's favor. They would have to just throw the case out if it's like comes to like a gun law or something. But I am pretty dedicated to, like, if California wants to disarm their citizenry, let them do it. I don't really care that much what happens there from a constitutional perspective.
I would say though that I think the new standard of the Supreme Court, Bruin, is a good standard in that it's the law will be upheld if it has a correlation or an analogy back to like 1789 or before the Civil War. So like if it's a type of regulation that we allowed back then, then it's then you can do it now. But if it's like a brand new thing where it's like almost a complete ban of gun together, you can't.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I think the Supreme Court granted cert recently to hear. It's kind of a nonsense argument, in my opinion. I actually, the Second Amendment absolutists will not like this one, but like I think they're just. I read the headline, so it might not be true. They're deciding whether owning a assault rifle or something like that is a constitutional right.
Wow. Like an AR-15 or like
I'm not sure. I just read a headline and I was like, this is an insane legal argument.
I don't know. After they voted in favor of birthright citizenship, I don't think that anything they say matters anymore.
No, it hasn't mattered since the Warren Court, really, for me.
There was a case for some reason, I don't remember what I was doing, but there was some case in Montana or Colorado maybe where a dude was being unjustly arrested and killed the cop arresting him, and the Supreme Court ruled in the defendant's favor.
Interesting. I wonder what the facts of that was.
I can't remember what the case was, but yeah, the cop drew a gun on him, tried to put him in handcuffs, and it wasn't a legal arrest, so the dude shot him. And the Supreme Court was like, yeah, you were totally justified for doing that. And they threw the case out.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah. But now they would never be so base now.
Well, there's a couple things I wanted to point out. Couple other notes on this essay.
Yeah.
Back to the topic.
Yeah, back to the topic. I'm going to drag us kicking and screaming back to the topic. So one of them is near the end. He says that slaveholding, this is on page 83 in my edition. He says that slaveholding was the acid test as to whether a state would remain agrarian or become eventually industrial. Which kind of puts I had never thought of it that way before, but it makes perfect sense. And it kind of puts a whole new spin on the Kansas conflict, because it makes it, less about that surface level issue of slavery and more about the root civilizational conflict that he's talking about here, which is the irrepressible conflict.
Do you, not to interrupt you, do you happen to have that quote offhand that you quoted in your podcast of bringing technology to Kansas or whatnot to like bring them out of the dark ages?
I do. Give me just 1 second.
Okay. Yeah, because that's like I think that's the perfect microcosm of what's being said here.
Yeah, while he's looking for that, I was also very when I read that quote, I was like, wow, that's an incredible point, because it kind of goes to what a lot of people the reductionist tendencies to say that it was slavery versus, freedom is because essentially it was agrarianism versus industrialism. But then
Yeah.
when you kind of just look at it, that all the industrialists were slaveholders, and all the agrarians had slaves, and all the industrialists, didn't. It's kind of just become a substitute one for one. And then so now now the modern people think it's just one for one the same, but it was very much not.
Yeah, and I think Owsley talks about it a little bit, but he even talks about, the vast majority of Southern white citizens, they didn't own slaves.
Mhm.
They just didn't. It was a very small percentage of the planter class. Some of the very wealthy yeomanry owned slaves, or maybe one or two like servant-esque slaves type people. But generally, slavery was reserved for the planter class, and yet the entire Southern population mobilized to fight industrialism and fight Northern aggression. So I think there's a little bit more there to discuss than just like, oh, slavery is agrarianism and industrialism is not agrarianism, because
Exactly.
half of the agrarian South didn't even own slaves.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I remember I was doing my master's in a very liberal school, and they were talking about this was years after the Civil War. They were talking about why white Southerners vote Republican when it doesn't benefit them, and they're like, oh well, it's just because they want the blacks to be enslaved, and this was during 2020, so it was like the height of this nonsense. And I remember getting reprimanded by my professor for like basically arguing back against this. She was a critical race theorist that came to speak to
Of
us.
course.
And I was like, this is a class on international security. I don't know why we're talking about this anyway.
Mhm.
But I started pushing back on it. And basically in their minds, they can't comprehend that it's just one for one. Everything is slavery or not slavery. And there is no other subject in the world.
Yeah, and this is I haven't really written anything about this on this Substack, but on my old one, before I deleted it, I had written an essay talking about, actually I was on Jason's podcast also defending the idea of kind of defending slavery. But we have
you can
such
go
a
back and
Marxist
look in
framework.
you can go back and look in my archive for that.
Yeah.
John's audio, his internet connection was a little bad, so it's not great. But yeah, we talked about it.
But we have such a Marxist framework that we can only think in terms of slavery or not slavery. And this is exactly like, if you read the Communist Manifesto, this is the way that Marx thinks. And this is why he destroys things like traditional marriage and patriarchy, because all of these things that might seem mildly oppressive are put in like the dialectic of slavery versus freedom. So traditional marriage is slavery. Patriarchy is slavery. All of these things. And this is, there was a fantastic quote that I had quoted in that original essay that was, talks about this exact thing where it's like, okay, well, once we go ahead and say, well, slavery is bad in the abstract, slavery as a principle is bad, then we have to admit that economic slavery, right? Any kind of capitalism, which I'm not a capitalist, but any kind of capitalism is bad. Traditional marriage is bad because it presupposes patriarchy. And then you get to such absurdity that, well, parenting is now bad because parents are oppressors of children. And so it just fundamentally destroys society when you can only think in terms of slavery and freedom.
Yeah. I found that quote, if you want me to read it real quick.
Yeah.
So this is quoted in Charles Robinson's book, The Kansas Conflict, and I'm actually not sure where he got it from originally, but it's Eli Thayer speaking. So he's quoting Eli Thayer, who is the backing up for a second. Charles Robinson was the first state governor of Kansas. He was a Massachusetts guy who went to Kansas with the Immigrant Aid Society, was an abolitionist, actually ended up running the more moderate faction of the Free State movement, but that's a rabbit trail. But anyway, Eli Thayer was the guy that founded the Immigrant Aid Society.
He was fucking awful.
Which was founded for the purpose of sending radical abolitionists to Kansas to colonize it, basically. And this is Thayer talking about his purpose in founding the Immigrant Aid Society. He says, quote, "Slavery was a great national curse. It practically ruined one half of the nation and greatly impeded the progress of the other half. It was a curse to the Negro, but a much greater curse to the white man. It made the slaveholders petty tyrants. It made the poor whites of the South more abject and degraded than the slaves themselves. That it was an insurmountable obstacle in the way of the nation's progress and prosperity, that it must be overcome and extirpated, that the way to do this was to go to the prairies and show the superiority of free labor civilization, to go with all our free labor trophies, churches and schools, printing presses, steam engines and mills, and in a peaceful contest convince every poor man from the South of the superiority of free labor, that it was much better to go and do something for free labor than to stay at home and talk of manacles and auction blocks and bloodhounds, that our work was not to make women and children cry in anti-slavery conventions by sentimental appeals, but to go and put an end to slavery." End quote.
Yeah.
So he's literally like, the way that we defeat slavery, it's almost like it's backwards. It's like, we're going to do this through industrialism.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's the way we're going to defeat slavery, is to demonstrate the superiority of industrialism over agrarianism.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then, let me pay my Irish immigrant 10 cents an hour to work 13 hours a day for those dang slaves in the South.
Yeah.
What page or what chapter of this was that original quote from that brought up this whole conversation?
The acid test one?
The quote from the quote from the Irrepressible Conflict.
Oh, yeah. It's towards the end of chapter 5. It's on page 83 in my edition.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
The first
he
paragraph,
almost says
words
that. That's almost like he doesn't really linger on that. It's almost like a side point, because he says it's like the opening clause of the sentence. He says, because slaveholding was the acid test as to whether a state would remain agrarian or become eventually industrial, the northern leaders wished that no more slave states should be carved from the Western territories. But yeah, he doesn't like make an argument for that or anything. It's just like an aside almost. But I thought it was interesting reframing of it.
Yeah. I still can't find it, but that's fine.
So the first words of the paragraph are "this abolition crusade."
Yeah, I see it. Okay, that's on a different page for me in my version. Yeah.
Going back to what you were saying earlier, John, I thought it was a great point about the kind of proto-Marxist kind of origins of this, both industrialism and what we have in modernity today. Is I think there's another aspect of it that really ties into the irrepressible conflict and the stuff we have going on now, is that Marxism inherently assumes historical materialism.
Yeah.
That society is constantly going on a straight line towards progress. And so that is essentially the founding, like what industrialism also assumes, is that we are going towards progress and everyone against us is like just basically impeding progress. Because, the South, when it's tied to the land and conservatism, this is just nonsense. It's evil, like you said. Where they're advancing society, they're making things better. Everything is getting better. It can't possibly get worse. That's why they constantly have to, you have to pick at your ancestors and deride them, because none of your ancestors can be better than you, because that negates historical materialism. You have to be getting better.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is we've talked about it before, but I guess we can never quite get enough Puritan hate in. But this is this is the progressive ideology of the Puritans. This is what they came to the New World with. And this is that they could never, this is fundamental to Puritan theology, that you can never be perfect enough in your interpretation of Scripture. So it has to be constantly reinterpreted. Each interpretation is better. You get, Puritan sect after Puritan sect after Puritan sect, and there's going to be no end to it. It's impossible because I think the Puritans were somewhat different because they're not assuming that perfection, like worldly perfection, is possible. So they always kind of have this innate understanding, like, hey, we're still fallen and we're never going to be able to understand Scripture perfectly, but we're going to understand it better than we have. I think that's fundamentally different than like than the materialist and industrialist that assume that we can perfect. We can have a perfect relationship between labor and leisure time. We can perfect industrial production. We can make it to where people don't have to work because we've created machines to do it. So I think it's fundamentally different, but it's the same progressive ideology between both of them. And there's a clear line between the Puritans that came off the Mayflower and the modern oligarchs and capitalists and progressive industrialists today.
Yeah, exactly. The transhumanists as well.
So while we're on Puritan hate, I found this while I talked about this in episode 1 of my other series, but I found this in an endnote to Frank Wilson Blackmore's biography of Charles Robinson, who I was just talking about a minute ago. But he's talking about the lineage of the Charles Robinson's second wife, Sarah Lawrence, came from a family called the Dwights that were like a big deal in Puritan New England back at that time. Her mother's maiden name was Clarissa Dwight. And so he's talking about the Dwight family in this endnote. It's like a couple page long endnote.
Wow.
That has a ton of stuff in it, and it's really interesting. But he says about the Dwight family, quote, "They could not call any man their father in their habits of religious thinking, not John Calvin, nor their own Jonathan Edwards or President Dwight, but like those very teachers of religious thought themselves, they were like those wise men of progress in their ideas of religious truth. Theology, a human science at the best, they regarded as being in itself as thoroughly capable of improvement from time to time as any other piece of man's wisdom, and more desirably so than any other because of its larger bearings in every way on human happiness, here and forever. The aspirations and impulses of those who have given character a name to the family have grown out of and clustered around such doctrines embedded deeply in their hearts as these. The sacredness of religious conditions is in individual minds. No infallible system of interpretation of the scriptures to be found anywhere in any human being, council, creed, or sect. Continual progress towards something ever better than before in each individual and in society at large. The greatest possible freedom of thought, feeling, and action to be allowed to everyone, consistent with similar rights to all others and the good of all. Justice to all men, liberty to all, and peace to men of peace." End quote.
Yeah. So there's actually a couple of things I'll talk about with that. The first one being, I'm not going to pontificate on Orthodox theology, but I will pontificate on Plato for a second. Anybody that's read Plato should be familiar with the doctrine of reminiscence. And there's really, it's an epistemology, but there's two ways fundamentally that we can understand knowledge. The first way being exactly like that, where it's this linear progressive, where we start with the imperfect and we get to the perfect. Plato's doctrine of reminiscence, and we see this in like the allegory of the cave, where man is fallen from his original condition into the cave, right? He doesn't start in the cave, he falls into it. And then life is about crawling out of the cave back up to the world of the forms that he fell from. So like St. Gregory talks about this a bit, and he kind of draws parallels to the allegory of the cave, where we lived in like the world of the forms, right? In perfection in the Garden of Eden, fell from that into the corporeal world of matter. And our life is now about crawling out of this world back into the world of the forms. So every bit of knowledge that we gain is remembering what was lost. That's Plato's doctrine of reminiscence. We once knew the form, so every time we learn, when babies learn what like a horse is, they're remembering what the form of a horse is that they once saw in the world of the forms. And so that's kind of like the Platonic, generally accepted traditional form of knowledge or epistemology. Then we get to like this progressive idea where we basically, it's materialist in the sense that like we start as nothing with no prior knowledge, and what we're learning is in this linear line towards some perfection that we don't know or never knew. So that's the first thing I wanted to mention there. The second thing I was going to mention, now I don't remember it because I talked about Plato. Liberty. What we mean by liberty. And that's something I think that's really important, is whether or not liberty just means liberty to do anything you want to. And I would propose that was not even the intention of like Jefferson or the inalienable rights, right? The rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, or property. I don't think that liberty there means the right to do whatever you want to do. It means the right to do what's good and to do what is right objectively. Mm-hmm. And once you are no longer doing what's good, you no longer have the right. You still maintain the right to liberty, but you're no longer when you're oppressed from doing what's wrong, your liberty is not being violated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I would even say that was that's firmly in line with the early American conception of liberty.
Yeah,
which is deeply out of line with the modern conception.
Yeah, it's like a father seeing his infant child about to walk off a cliff and then grabs him. It's like, well, you stopped his liberty. Like, no.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that ties into the slavery, because this idea of liberty or freedom is the justification for abolishing slavery, is like, well, everybody has the right to liberty. Okay, well, if you read, is it from chapter, I believe it's from chapter 5 in the Irrepressible Conflict, when he starts talking about slavery. And he says, quote, the second paragraph of chapter 5, a little bit ways down, he says, quote, Negroes had come into the southern colonies in such numbers that people feared for the integrity of the white race. For the Negroes were cannibals and barbarians, and therefore dangerous. No white man who had any contact with slavery was willing to free the slaves and allow them to dwell among whites. Slavery was a peril, at least a risk, but freed blacks were considered a menace too great to be hazarded. And I think that ties into this idea where the abolitionists and the modern libtards, they want to talk about liberty and freedom, and the slaves, they had a right to liberty and freedom, where the Southerners would have said, well, no, they don't, because, half of these Negroes that we have still remember what human flesh tastes like from Africa. And we don't, they don't have a right to just do what they did there here. That's not a right that they have. They have a right to pursue, godliness and righteousness, and they can do that while enslaved.
And I think that really, really is a good kind of it's a good parallel to what a lot of Russian and even Orthodox thinkers thought about liberty and class, within Christianity, is that I know St. Justin Popovich, he says, in truth, there is only one freedom, the holy freedom of Christ, whereby he freed us from sin, from evil, and from the devil. All other freedoms are illusory. That is to say, they are all slavery.
Yep.
And so, you read a lot of the Russian, not just even theologians, but just even secular writers will talk about how a peasant or a serf, wasn't of the mind that like, oh, I need to become a noble, I need to become an aristocrat, I need to, upward social mobility. They're like, this is what God has gave me in my life, and I thank him for it, and I will be the best that I can be in this role. There was no kind of, I mean, there obviously later in the Russian Empire there would be, but it was kind of the idea that, this, I am free. I'm not, just because I'm not living my best life, partying it up in St. Petersburg every day, does not mean I'm not free.
Yeah. And that's Dabney talks about that when in Defense of Virginia and Through Her the South. He talks about what we actually mean by slavery. And he defines slavery, especially in the Southern sense of the word, as being the ownership of one's economic productivity. And we are physically incapable of owning someone's soul.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we cannot do so. As much as everybody hates Dugan, especially now, in political Platonism, he makes the point where he talks about Plato, who was a slave at one point. Somebody owned Plato. But he then says, well, was Plato ever actually a slave? It's like, well, that's a good question, right? Was he? Not really, because he went on to be one of the most revolutionary and most important thinkers ever, and nobody could ever own Plato's thoughts or his soul, even though they owned his economic productivity. And in the Southern sense, Dabney talks about how as much as a white planter could own a Negro's economic productivity, he could never own his soul, and he still had equal standing before God when they went to church together. And I think that's kind of the difficult thing to reconcile if you're a materialist with slavery, is you don't have the ability to say, well, yeah, someone is economically a slave, but they're not a slave spiritually. Nobody can own them as a person. They can't own their soul. They can't degrade their position before God. And that's a big problem with like Marxism, which is inherently materialist.
Well, yeah, and even the sort of like, if you define slavery that way as the ownership of someone's economic productivity, and then also define slavery as inherently bad, it's like the presupposition there is that like the economic productivity is the most important thing.
Exactly.
Because like that kind of ties right in with industrialism, right? Like that's the industrialist mindset to assume that economic productivity is the most important thing, and therefore the ownership of someone else's economic productivity is bad.
Yeah. And then the oligarchs are talking out their ass when that's what they do, is own entire populations and civilizations' economic productivity. But then they're going to decry slavery.
And that's why communism needs capitalism, is that people are under the mind that like communism, hates, and it does hate capitalism, but it says capitalism is a necessary step towards socialism. And then because that if a slavery is, owning the economic production of a person, then that's essentially all workers in a capitalist society. And so that's what they kind of need, is it necessitates that basically everyone is a slave, and then it's essentially one big slave revolt, the vanguard of the proletarian.
Yeah. And I don't know if you listened to the first two episodes we did, but the Southern agrarians, they talk about Sovietism being the sort of ultimate fulfillment of capitalism. So in like the National Socialism framework, every citizen is also a slave. There's no way around it, right? Hitler owned the economic productivity of every German citizen. It's fundamentally incompatible with agrarianism. It's fundamentally incompatible with a free living. Whether or not that's wrong is a different question. But it is true that every German citizen in the Third Reich was a slave. The same thing is true from, the Soviet Russia. And the same thing is true today for the most part in America. Almost everyone is a slave to this economic system, which is capitalism, but it's not this laissez-faire Jeffersonian capitalism. It is a radical oligarchical capitalism where, Elon Musk is a trillionaire and employs thousands upon thousands and thousands of people. And at the same time, BlackRock owns half of the companies that are chains or that are staples in the United States and employs probably a significant portion of the American population. All of this, and not only that, all of these are funded by the United States federal government, right? Or at least they're given tax breaks, they're given some type of capital by the US federal government. And so really, what is the distinguishing factor between what we have in the United States and some kind of like Soviet communism? And the Southern agrarians they don't seem to recognize the distinction between the two.
Yeah. The real communists are the American capitalists, like we talked about before.
Yeah, it's a pretty damning quote.
Yeah.
I think that's it's a really interesting line of thinking, because it kind of reminds me of something I read just this past week, actually. And this is going to take us a really weird rabbit hole. But at the start of the show, I was like, oh, I don't want to go into a lot of rabbit holes. And I'm doing it every 5 minutes. But have y'all, I'm going to laugh. Have y'all ever heard of Nazi Maoism?
No.
No.
It's a real political ideology from Italy in the 70s, or in the years of lead. It was by Franco Freda, but he wasn't totally crazy as the name sounds. He talked about exactly what you were talking about, how this game is like, everyone is an economic slave in that regard. And then what these people do is very smart, is that the materialist left might think they're pushing back against it, but they're still working within the frame of industrialism, whether they know it or not. And so what the kind of, not the overlord sounds like a weird word for it, but overlords, what they do is they allow them, he said, the quote was like, allow them to pretend they are a bull for a second, even though they're just a cow. Like they just, allow them to think they're actually breaking free and making progress, but it's still industrialism. You're still a slave, but they think they've made progress.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I see a lot of what, the leftists and, like the capitalists are doing today. Is I think we were talking about it last week on Substack, is someone made a good point, is that both sides assume industrialism.
Yeah, that was actually from the essay I wrote on, it was called like Feminism Was Right or something.
Yes, that was a good one. I actually sent that to my wife, and she actually liked that.
Yeah, and it's very true that it's very, very difficult in especially modern America to break free from the industrial system.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost more sad and just really pitiful to see these Americans, it's really bad, Southerners too, especially, to see them defending capitalism as if it's this great free economic system, while you yourself are on fucking, I don't know what they call it, like government food money or whatever.
EBT.
Yeah. EBT, food stamps.
Like you're paying for your food with food stamps and you're praising capitalism.
Exactly. I wrote a post about that earlier. It was like a right-wing critique of capitalism. And then I said in it, my grandparents picked cotton. Like they actually did, that was their job, is picking cotton. And they're from South Carolina. My family's originally from there. And then what happened was, they picked cotton and then worked in the textile mills there, and essentially in a company town in rural South Carolina. And then they did everything that capitalists told them to do. As long as you roll up your sleeves and work hard, you'll be fine.
Yep.
And then they did that. They, from sun up to sundown, picking cotton or working in the fields. And then one day the factory just closed down. They didn't do anything wrong, but the factory closed down and went to China because they realized they can pay, a Chinese 6-year-old a cent, and they don't have to pay an American actual money. And so now the company's making so much money, but the Southerners, like my grandparents, they're out of jobs. There's no other industry for miles and miles and miles. So they're just unemployed now. They're on welfare. And these people seem some to think that like capitalism is American, like it's part of our identity, and like that just puts you into poverty. What are you talking about?
Yeah. And on that capitalism is American thing, Virginia had laws it was quote laws concerning entails or inheritance of property, where they were not like radically what we consider radically for American capitalists, no government intervention. They had it written in their state legislation that the property that was inherited, or that was the inheritance of, buddy, was to be divided equally among their children or beneficiaries, to ensure that in several generations there would be economic equality between Virginians. And that's something that would be radically opposed by 99% of Southern capitalists. They would see that as being government oversight, government intervention. No, they don't have any right to do that. Inheritance, that's ours to give. And the Virginian government in the mid 18th century said, well, no, actually, we're going to control that to make sure that we have economic equality. And this is, I think, this is really part of, we've talked about this so much with the Southern agrarians and with the South in general, but it breaks free of all of these stereotypes and just these paradigms that we typically work from. It just breaks free of all of it, and it contradicts everything. It's something completely different and radical.
Yeah, so all I heard from that is that John is a confirmed Nazi Maoist.
Exactly.
I'm happy I could introduce Nazi Maoism to the South.
Yeah, these it's really interesting to read about the way that it's really interesting to read these Southern authors and the way that we talked about it last week with Alexander, when he asked, what do they sound like? And the answer is, well, they sound like leftists. And it's true.
Yeah.
They do. And yet they're so far, they would sound like right-wing Nazis to a libtard, and they'd sound like libtards to a right-wing Nazi.
Yeah, they're like the next evolution of horseshoe theory.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's wildly interesting. All right, so talking about slavery a little bit more precisely from the essay, he says, quote, "Slavery has been practically forced upon the country by England over the protest of colonial assemblies. During the 18th century, it has ceased to be profitable, and colonial moral indignation rose correspondingly. However, when the revolution came and the southern colonies gained their independence, they did not free the Negroes." And then going down a little bit further, he says, "They never argued that the slaves could never be freed unless they could be deported. They argued the slaves could never be freed unless they could be deported back to Africa or to the West Indies. This conviction became more fervent when the terrifying Negro insurrections in Santo Domingo and Haiti destroyed the white population and civilizations almost completely and submerged the remainder under barbarian control. All early abolitionists, which meant..." Where'd that go? Which meant most of the Southern people up until around 1800 were abolitionists only on condition of colonization. As a result, there were organized many colonization societies, mostly in the South, during that period. And then going down the next paragraph, he says, "Let the blood of slavery rest upon the heads of those who forced it upon the South." So this is... something people don't really realize. Georgia was the first United States colony to outlaw the slave trade in its organic constitution. They outlawed it completely. Virginia followed suit. None of the southern colonies ever partook in the slave trade, not a single one of them. The slave trade was restricted to New England only. They were doing that against the law of they were actually doing that against the law of England prior to the Revolutionary War. And they kept doing it. And what was happening was New England was importing slaves, and they were selling them to the South because the South had a higher need for them, obviously. but it was not something that Southerners ever asked for or wanted. It was forced upon them. And so when Owsley talks about let the blood of the slaves be upon those who forced it upon us, he's talking about the English and the New Englanders. Jefferson talks about this in the Rights of British Americans when he talks about some of the violations of English rights that the Brits were committing. One of them is being that the American colonies were begging to end the slave trade. They did not want Negroes imported to the United States. And England kept sending them. And then when the slave trade was outlawed, they stopped and New England continued it. So from a arguing against sort of the libtarded anti-slavery proponents, the South was not the one importing the slaves. And generally speaking, slaves in the South enjoyed a much higher quality of life than those in the North did.
It really is an interesting thing that I've never thought about before.
Yeah.
Until reading this.
Yeah. And, and there was laws all throughout Virginia that, what was it? I think it was after the year 1809. I think it was 1809. All slaves older than 25 years old had to be emancipated. Then there's a whole list of laws about what those slaves are to do once they're emancipated. The laws can essentially be boiled down to the slaves have to leave the Virginia territory, and if anywhere else accepts them, then great. But the important part of it is that Virginia is a state, and none of the southern states wanted slaves in the state. They did not want it. They would much rather get rid of them and replace the labor force with whites. That's kind of the overarching point of like the Old South's laws around slavery. But they could not be emancipated. There was just no way that they could just be freed and set free on the Southern population.
That does always make me wonder, what had the South won, I wonder what would the plan be going forward, because it would have died out eventually, as Robert E. Lee had talked about, that there was a natural end coming forth. So I really wonder how it would have been handled.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not of the mind that slavery was necessarily an ideal. I don't think that America should have ever had Negroes to begin with.
I agree.
But it's obvious that once they're here, you have to do something about it. All the founding fathers were concerned about a race war or about competing political interests. They knew that something had to be done. And I do think that in the American context, slavery is probably the best way to handle them.
Yeah, that's definitely not something that's going to go over easy with a lot of modern people today. But I think that's actually like a really, like, it probably is the only real argument. I mean, they weren't exactly Christian at that time either.
No. And I think it's Owsley that he talks about. There's one author, and I think it's Owsley, that literally says that they still remembered the taste of human flesh from when they were brought from Africa.
Yeah, that was him.
I mean, that's unfathomable to most white people, especially Americans. Like, our moral standard is so high that the thought of eating another person, that's revolting.
I mean, have you ever read the British Red Cross reports from like Benin? Or one of those? They're in like the mid 1800s, so it's not like they were like 900s or something. They were talked about how they went to Benin City and it was the worst city of all of them that practiced like horrible juju magic, and like their buildings were made out of a mix of blood and mud, and that there was just a pit in the middle of the city filled with like children's bones that they would eat.
Oh my gosh!
Like, it was horrible. He said like this is truly like the most godless place in the entire world.
Oh my goodness!
And then that's like the mid 1800s. So like they've come from that.
Yeah. And this is the stuff like when Dabney doesn't even defend the slave trade. He actually thinks it's wrong. But he does defend slavery on the basis that, look, we're not guilty for something our ancestors did. And the fact that our ancestors brought slaves here does not necessitate us freeing them at our own peril. Like, we don't have to release these slaves that are literally cannibals, some of them, just because our ancestors made a mistake. Like, they're ours now, and it sucks, but we have to the most humane way possible for us and for them. And
that's
in
This is
Go ahead.
This is like I mean, the modern mind almost can't comprehend this because we're so infected with like Enlightenment blank slateism.
Mhm.
But it's like I don't think people have any idea. I don't accept myself from this either. But I don't think people have any idea how depraved people can get.
Yeah,
Like
especially
on the
not
whole,
Americans.
especially on a not even a racial level, but a national level, like
Yeah,
national in the sense of a nation or like a people.
yeah. We enjoy such a high quality of life as far as like morality goes in the United States. We're so insulated from the rest of the world and the depravity that is actually exists out there.
Well, yeah, and you know, even going back to like the Old Testament times where God commanded the extermination of the Canaanite peoples
Yeah,
when after Israel left Egypt. And we think, a lot of people think that's appalling now. Like, how could you just exterminate a whole people? It's like, well, how depraved were they? Like,
yeah,
I mean, the Canaanites were pretty, they were doing like infant sacrifice and all kinds of like truly horrific shit,
yeah.
and I don't think we comprehend that even a little bit.
No, we absolutely do not. Were
Yeah,
you gonna
there's
say something?
me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to touch on that one Old Testament point. I was reading in, gosh, was it Judges? I don't know, it was either Judges or Joshua before. But it was basically talking about how like at that time was like and we all know Moloch now, but like Moloch had like really specialized in like human sacrifice and especially child human sacrifice back then. Like that is really bad. And
Yeah,
at
and
the time of
actually,
Judges, the Israelites were getting involved with that too.
yeah, and so do you guys know Martyr Made?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Martyr Made podcast. That's one of
Yeah.
my favorite
Apparently he's
favorite history
Orthodox.
podcast, probably. Yeah, I heard that somewhere. I didn't know that.
I don't know. I didn't either.
But I wouldn't have guessed it based on his interpretations of Job. But anyway, I've listened to him for a long time. He's actually the one that kind of inspired me to do my other podcast. But anyway, he put out an article that was kind of about this, like, and he highlights a couple of even modern tribes in like the Amazon jungle or whatever that survive to this day and are relatively uncontacted by civilization. He talks about that, and then he talks about the Punic Wars, in the early days of the Roman Republic, and how they, Rome fought against Carthage in 3 different wars. And one of the famous things, the second Punic War is the most famous one. That's the one that Hannibal was involved in, the general on the Carthaginian side, and wiped out a Roman army at Cannae. It was like 80,000 Romans killed in one single day.
Wow.
Like just an astounding defeat for the Romans. And it's like, it's famous in history because Rome ended up winning the war in the end. Even though they had this completely catastrophic defeat, they were able to recover from that and still win the war in the end. And historians talk about this a lot, and they talk about the Roman ability to take a punch like that was just, far and away anybody else at the time. But in this article, he talks about this, and he's kind of speculating, and he'll tell you he's speculating too, but he's speculating on why the Romans would keep going, like what actually motivated them to keep going after that. And the thing he speculates on is that this was a religious crusade by the Romans against the Carthaginians, because the Carthaginians were originally a Phoenician colony. And the Phoenicians were like this naval power in the Mediterranean in the ancient world. They were a Canaanite people, and they inherited a lot of these child sacrifice, like horrific Moloch style practices from the Canaanites. And they were still practicing this stuff in the I think, the 3rd century BC when these wars were going on. And the Greeks and the Romans both were horrified by human sacrifice. Like, it's in their myths. Like, going all the way back to the Trojan War, like the sacrifice of Iphigenia was why the expedition to Troy was cursed, and why it ended up so badly, and why everybody was, the whole Greek army was scattered on the way back. And it seems like everybody involved in that war had bad ends pretty much. And it was kind of all goes back to Agamemnon's sacrifice of his daughter for fair winds to sail there in the first place. But anyway, the point is, Greeks and the Romans both were horrified by human sacrifice. And the speculation he gives in this article is that this was a religious crusade by the Romans. They were so horrified by the practices of the Carthaginians that they were like, we cannot lose this war. And that's what motivated them to keep going after such a catastrophic defeat. And they ended up winning in the end. And then they very famously just completely leveled Carthage, exterminated the people after the 3rd Punic War. So, yeah, I don't know what the point of that was, but I thought it was related.
Yeah, no, and it actually is, because I have a somewhat unrelated to your somewhat unrelated quote about the Romans. So, going back to the topic of slavery a bit, it's no secret that the Greeks and Romans had slaves en masse. And Jefferson, talking about the difference between the slaves of the South in America and the slaves of the Romans in Greece, he says, quote, "Yet notwithstanding these and other discouraging circumstances among the Romans, their slaves were often their rarest artists. They excelled too in science, inasmuch as to be usually employed as tutors to their masters' children. Epictetus, Terence, and Phaedrus were slaves, but they were of the race of whites. It is not their condition, but nature which has produced the distinction." And then a little bit later, he says, quote, "I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only, that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to whites in both the endowment, both of body and mind. It is not against experience to suppose that different species of the same genus or varieties of the same species may possess different qualifications. Will not a lover of natural history then, one who views the graduations in all the races of animals with the eye of philosophy, excuse an effort to keep those in the department of man as distinct as nature has formed them? This unfortunate difference of color and perhaps of faculty is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people." And that's from the Notes on the State of Virginia, query 14, in case anybody's interested. But now tying that into your reference to the Romans, the idea that especially white Americans, I mean, really just any Europeans, but especially Americans, we had such a high standard of morality that the idea that we could politically affiliate with those who did not share our Christianity, our general sense of morality and natural law, was just completely unthinkable to us. We would not have it. Southern whites would absolutely not be in politics. They would not have representatives from Virginia that were okay with human sacrifice or okay with eating human flesh. That was something that was fundamentally incompatible with the American way of life, and they would fight tooth and nail to make sure that never happened. Mm-hmm. So to tie it all together, that's my little tie-in there.
Yeah.
To tie it back originally to what the start of the conversation, we were talking about what would happen essentially if the South won, how would they handle slaves, and because they were so very recently removed from cannibalism and juju. Mm-hmm. I have a quote from Robert E. Lee on what he thought the proper role of white Americans to slaves should be. And I thought it was pretty interesting, and it kind of goes in line with what you said, John. He said, quote, "How long their subjugation may be necessary is known only by the wise and merciful providence. Their emancipation will sooner result from the mild and melting influence of Christianity than the storms and tempests of fiery controversy. This influence is slow and sure. The doctrines and miracles of our Savior have required nearly 2,000 years to convert but a small part of the human race. And even Christian nations, what gross errors still exist? While we see the course of the final abolition of human slavery is onward, and we give it the aid of our prayers, we must leave the progress as well as the results in the hands of He who sees the end. So he was basically essentially saying that, in order for us to Christianize them, this may be a necessary temporary evil.
Yes.
To help them get to God.
Yeah, slavery was fundamentally understood as a corrective institution in the South.
Mm-hmm.
And Dabney echoing that, well, I don't know if it was echoing, I don't know when that was written, but I think it was 1867, Dabney wrote, in defense of Virginia, he says, I don't have the quote pulled up, but he says something akin to, we hope that slavery is abolished in the United States, but not through enforcing and encouraging guilt of the slave owner, but by converting the slaves by the gospel. And I think that was for Dabney argues that was the point of slavery in the Old Testament as well, was it was a corrective institution that was intended to raise the slaves out of their natural condition of slavery through, providing them with the moral compass of being able to govern themselves. And that was the way that slavery was understood as an institution in the South. That's why slavery, contrary to popular belief, there were no laws against slaves being churched and taught to read in the South. The state could not do it, but individual owners were free to church their slaves and teach them to read, and most slave owners did do that.
Yeah,
most of the slaves in the Old South were churched. Most of them were taught to read.
Stonewall Jackson himself had developed Sunday schools specifically for enslaved and freed blacks. And I remember it was some kind of controversy with other people around him, didn't particularly like that, but he thought it was necessary to teach them how to read in order for them to learn to read the Bible. And then he even adopted a young slave girl who had a severe disability because he thought that he and his wife could properly take care of her. Whereas, if she was just a slave in some other person's property, she may have just been neglected or found unuseful, but he found it necessary to take care of her so he could properly teach her Christianity and she could grow up properly.
Yeah. And this goes back to that Owsley quote earlier that I disagreed with the South being just like mildly deistic. They were self-consciously aware that their calling in life in that moment in the antebellum South was to preach the gospel to the enslaved folk. They knew that. They were self-consciously aware of that. And probably couldn't find the quote, but there was a quote that, Jason, you quoted. I had asked you about it at one point. And it was about the life of slaves on the Kansas-Missouri border. And it was talking about basically their day-to-day interaction with the masters and the way that the little Negro children were doted on and spoiled, and they were taught and all that stuff. And those are the type of quotes that we don't typically hear. We typically hear, there's the quote in here from the Southern, the Liberator magazine, which is just absurd, right? This is the type of
the William Lloyd Garrison one.
I was going to read that quote because this is the type of stuff that we actually hear, which is, quote, "It was the cry of William Lloyd Garrison that slavery was a crime and the slaveholders were criminals. He established the famous Liberator, which preached unremitting and ruthless war upon slavery and the slaveholder. He knew no moderation. He had no balance or sense of consequence. His was the typical radical mind which demands that things be done at once, and which tries to force nature, which wants to tear up by the roots. Although he was completely ignorant of the South and of Negro slavery, he dogmatically assumed an omniscient power of judgment over the section and the institution. In the Liberator, or in the anti-slavery tracts fostered by the anti-slavery societies which he aided or instigated, he set no bounds of accusation or denunciation. The slave master, said Garrison, debauched his slave women, had children by them, and in turn defiled his own children and sold them into the slave markets. The slave plantation was primarily a gigantic harem for the master and his sons. The handsome octoroon coachman shared the bed of the mistress when the master was away from home, and the daughter was frequently away in some secluded nook to rid themselves of the undesirable Negro offspring. Ministers of the gospel who owned or sanctioned slavery were included in his sweeping indictment of miscegenation and prostitution. In short, Garrison and the anti-slavery societies which he launched, followed soon by the Northern churchmen, stigmatized the South as a black brothel. But this was not all. The Southern slave owners were not merely moral lepers. They were cruel who drove their slaves till they dropped and died, who starved them to save food, let them go cold and almost naked to save clothing, let them dwell in filthy pole pens rather than build them comfortable cottages, beat them unmercifully with leather thongs filled with spikes, dragged cats over their bodies and faces, trailed them with bloodhounds which rent and chewed them, then sprinkled their wounds with salt and red pepper. Infants were torn from their mother's breast and sold to Simon Legree's. Families were separated and scattered to the four winds. This brutal treatment of slaves reacted upon the masters and made them brutal and cruel in their dealings with their fellow whites. Such charges, printed in millions upon millions of pamphlets, were sent out all over the world. Sooner or later, much of it was accepted as true in the North. And those are all, that is the generalization of the Southern slaveholder that most of the American, even the Southern population, accepts. You hear still the apologetic from Southerners like, oh, I never owned slaves personally. I'm not guilty of it. As if there was something to be, that you should feel guilty for. And it's just, it was not the case that Southern slaveholders were dragging cats over their slaves and putting salt and red pepper in their wounds. Like, that's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
The most striking thing about this is really the role of propaganda that's still played back then.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about it, the very start, one of the first paragraphs of this essay was Owsley talking about how the older Confederates who experienced the war or grew up in it, they were too hard to change because they kind of developed a cocoon for themselves where they would refuse to read newspapers altogether. And that kind of reminds me of modernity today. Like, how much of us are, out there watching Fox News or CNN now? We don't watch that stuff because we know, just like the Confederates did back then, it's all nonsense.
Exactly. Yep. And even back then, that was one of the most striking parts of that quote was that the South was just a giant brothel of black slaves. And what, that mulatto guy that gets all kind of news coverage for being a descendant of Thomas Jefferson because Jefferson had sex with Sally or whatever her name was.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all that propaganda that we are constantly flooded with. That was even the case in their time. It's never changed.
Yeah, there's also this kind of concept that goes into that. Do y'all know about the Golden Circle?
Vague. That sounds familiar.
So it wasn't really an actual plan of the Confederacy, but it was like a secret society within the Confederacy to invade if they won the Civil War, invade Mexico and take over the Caribbean and would form the Golden Circle there. And that's kind of used a lot in conjunction with this kind of weird William Lloyd Garrison propaganda about like miscegenation and rape and stuff. About a lot of modern white nationalists from the North will be like, oh, the South was actually the North was the based ones. The South, they were planning on going and mixing with all the like Latin Americans because they didn't want to be white anymore.
Yeah. Yep. And that is something I've heard so many times, especially from the National Socialist crowd, that the North, they were the pure Aryans and they wanted to maintain the Aryan race, so they wanted to send the Negroes away. And it's just it's all so tiresome. I mean, it really is. It's just completely ridiculous.
Yeah. It's also tiresome. That's a good quote.
Wholesome Aryan, like 48er Germans that came and fought over here, and wholesome Aryan Abraham Lincoln communicating with Karl Marx during the war.
Yeah.
So
Well-
I think it is worth saying that, like, I don't think that, and I don't think either of you guys have this impression either, but I'm just saying this for the audience. Like, I don't think any of us would say that, like, Southern slave owners across the board were like managing their slaves with the slave's best interest in mind.
Yeah, of course,
all the time. Like, because the temptation is to, when you hear these ridiculous things from like William Lloyd Garrison and other Northerners of the time, and even people today, it's like they're painting this caricature of Southern slave owners of being evil and like just sadistic for fun and all that kind of thing, all that kind of stuff. But the temptation is to go in the completely opposite direction and paint this like idyllic picture of Southern slave life, and it's like, I don't think any of us have that impression, and I don't want to give that impression to anybody else either. But it's like, there's a mixed bag. People are people, and there's good ones and bad ones, and they manage things well, they manage things badly, and it's there's all kinds.
Yeah, absolutely. It's never. I am of the mind that reactionary radicalism is never the right way to go. And it's true both ways. That it's true that not every Southern slave owner was a righteous Stonewall Jackson, and not every Southern slave owner was a William Lloyd Garrison, comic book supervillain. There was definitely a mixed bag, and I'll read both the good examples and the bad examples.
And that's exactly what we've been kind of subject to as Southerners, is that the historical reductionism of the South, of the cause, is that, we shouldn't be going around doing the exact same thing as the North or liberals in general, that reducing everything to a simple black or white.
Yeah. Yep. Well, it's I think it's gonna. I always like to kind of get the closing a little bit started with the very final paragraph. So I'm going to go ahead and this chapter 7 is real short. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this part. Quote, thus the two sections clashed at every point. Their economic systems and interests conflicted. Their social systems were hostile. Their political philosophies growing out of their economic and social systems were as impossible to reconcile as it is to cause two particles of matter to occupy the same space at the same time. And their philosophies of life, growing out of the whole situation in each section, were as two elements in deadly combat. What was food for the one was poison for the other. When the balance of power was destroyed by the rapid growth of the North, and the destruction of this balance was signalized in the election of Lincoln by a frankly sectional, hostile political party, the South, after a futile effort at obtaining a concession from Lincoln, which would partly restore the balance of power, dissolved its partnership with the industrial North. This struggle between an agrarian and an industrial civilization then was the irrepressible conflict, the house divided against itself, which must become, according to the doctrine of the industrial section, all the one or all the other. It was the doctrine of intolerance, crusading, standardizing alike in industry and in life. The South had to be crushed out. It was in the way. It impeded the progress of the machine. So Juggernaut drove his car across the South. This is somewhat relevant to a lot of discussion that we've been having on Substack lately, with the idea that destroying the particular in favor of the universal is never good, and it's always bad. Mm-hmm. We've been obviously having that discussion in the sort of the context of the white race as a whole, that we should not subject individual localities or regions or nations of the white race into one homogenous, agglomerated white race. But the principle still holds true here, that the industrial North is that all-consuming machine which seeks to universalize and flatten all distinctions and make everyone exactly the same, because that's what the machine needs. The machine doesn't need uniqueness. It doesn't need regional distinctions and accents. It needs cogs. It needs parts to make the machine work. And the parts are completely disposable, and they can be replaced by Indian or Chinese immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, with the new Supreme Court ruling in favor of birthright citizenship, that's exactly what we're seeing. The machine has taken that next step to just outright declaring itself as needing just parts, irrespective of race, religion, local regions, anything, any type of particular distinctions that make states and regions unique.
And I think, I've been too busy talking about Nazi Maoism to actually bring up the probably most important part of this is tariffs. That you talked about the universalizing aspect of it, is that the North did not care about what was good for the South or what was good for the individual states. Is that the tariffs were good for industry. And so tariffs, they would use the federal government to apply universally. Where the South said, as applied to South Carolina, those are unconstitutional.
Yep.
But, that rejection of what's good for one state doesn't matter. What's good for the whole, the GDP, which is what we talk about all now today. The universal
GDP
is the most important.
Now, I know that you have to go soon, Marco, but we've talked about tariffs a bit. Owsley talks about them. So just for those that are unaware, we've seen this a lot, especially with like Trump's second term, with all these tariffs, blanket tariffs that he's been issuing. What exactly were the tariffs that were imposed on the South that caused the nullification crisis in South Carolina, and then were a large part of the War of Northern Aggression? Like, what did these do to the South?
Okay, so the important thing to understand was, obviously we've talked ad nauseum about how the North was industrial and the South was agrarian. So the North used tariffs to protect its own industry, which makes, economic sense. You're going to put a tax on imported goods from other places because you want to protect your own goods. So that way, what the manufactured goods from the industry is protected. But the problem was the South, it's not industrial, so they need to get manufactured goods. The North is selling them at such a high price that the South has to buy those tariffs from Europe. So the South sends its raw materials to, Liverpool, to Birmingham, to France. And they have great deals. They make them and they send their materials back to the South. The North wants tariffs on that to force the South to buy the North's raw materials, or their manufactured goods. But they're so expensive. And so they enact these tariffs. And what that forces the South to do is spend so much more money buying manufactured goods from the North than they would have gotten from Europe. But then in response, Britain and France aren't just going to take those tariffs lightly. They're going to put tariffs of their own on America. So now not only does the South have to spend more money to buy manufactured goods from the North, now they can't even sell their raw materials to Europe nearly as what they used to be able to sell them for. So they're making less money and having to spend more money, and they're just economically devastated. The industry in the North is growing and growing and growing, and the South is just being squeezed out. It got so bad that the farmers from South Carolina had to leave South Carolina to go to the Mississippi Delta because it was more fertile land there, and South Carolina's economy dropped like some crazy percentage, and it got so bad that the nullification crisis, Calhoun wanted to nullify the tariff of abominations, which was, I think it was around 45% ad valorem tax. And so they wanted to nullify it as applied to South Carolina or threaten to secede because it just devastated the South economically. And you see what happens afterwards when Southerners take power is they they get rid of the tariffs. The next 20 or 30 so years, the Southern economy just booms. It's prosperous and wonderful. Now come 1856 or 1857, the radical Republicans, which are just starting to form, proposed the moral tariff, which this tariff abomination is 45%. This one is going to be on 60% tariff, which was devastating to the South. They said, absolutely no way. And so once they get elected, they know that tariff's coming. And they said, there's no chance that we can make anything work. That added with the, bleeding Kansas and the Western territories are just completely untenable.
Yeah. And yeah. So for all the people that are in favor of like Trump's tariffs, the American people pay that money. And this is why people like Jefferson and the Southern founders and the Southern, I hate to say economists because they weren't economists, but the Southern statesmen up through Lincoln's War and afterwards, they were so in favor of just absolute free trade, because free trade, while maybe detrimental to an industrial society, is actually a benefit to the agrarian society, which only produces raw material. So people like Jefferson, who were radically in favor of free trade, did not believe in tariffs, except for very small protective tariffs. He and the other Southern statesmen, they recognized this risk that the agrarian South was taking with being agrarian and without having industry to actually produce commodities. They produced the material which produce commodities. And they knew that this was a risk.
I have the exact stats in front of me right now. Mm-hmm. So the moral tariff was the tariff of abominations was 45%. It was so bad that South Carolina got so devastated that 56,000 whites left South Carolina because they're just untenable. Then in the Southern Democrats took power. Before then, they reduced the rates to 25%, and then 1857 down to 15%. This was so beneficial to the U.S. economy that it increased revenue by $20 million, from $20 million to $80 million in just 30 years. Then the radical Republicans proposed the moral tariff. So they almost acceded over a 45% tariff. The moral tariff proposed a 70% tax on dutiable imports.
Goodness.
So if you can imagine the absolute indignation that the South would have over the audacity to do that.
And that was just a blanket tariff on every single product coming in the United States?
No, it was I think there was some nuance on it. There was 70% tax on dutiable imports, and then there's some nuance. It's not blanket on everything, but it was for something. And then there was another quote: by 1860 and before the moral tariff, the South comprised of less than 30% of the U.S. population, but was paying 85% of its taxes.
Wow. That's staggering.
So we don't talk about tariffs or the economy because that doesn't fit into the slavery narrative, but it's just a perfect example of the northern industry, if I'm being specific. The industry, businesses, banks wanted to use the federal government to essentially make themselves richer at the expense of the South. The South simply said, do not do anything, federal government, that will hurt us. That is arbitrary. It's unconstitutional to take an action that hurts one person for the specific benefit of one interest. But the businesses didn't care, and the federal government didn't either.
Yeah. And this all goes back to the old Jeffersonian versus Hamiltonianism debate. This was the whole debate between having a centralized federal banking system and really not having any banking system, letting the states decide what they wanted to do. Mm-hmm. That's staggering. Wow.
I think it was Jefferson's plan was to have no tariffs whatsoever. And by the way, I should mention the Confederate Constitution, in its specific things that it forbid from Congress from ever doing, was enacting a tariff because they had this history.
Yeah.
Which is vastly important. And Jefferson's idea was that there would be no tariffs, and that the trade of the raw materials to England would be, or to Europe in general, would be so profitable that they would use the profits from that to purchase better farming equipment or materials to essentially improve everything. And they didn't need essentially these tariffs or extra taxes to fund anything.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a very, Jefferson, I don't know if he's necessarily considered the founder, but he was very devoted to a laissez-faire, just absolute free market capitalism, which is radically different than what we have today and what we consider to be free market capitalism. Those terms have been sort of abused and adopted by the industrial society, and it's not what it used to be in the agrarian South.
Yeah, exactly. And then I should also mention, as a last thing, is that what you notice is before the election of 1860, on the table is the moral tariff, the 70% tariff. What is not on the table is the abolition of slavery. What is on the table is the Corwin Amendment. The Corwin Amendment would enshrine slavery into the Constitution forever.
Yeah.
Lincoln supported it. Illinois supported it. I think Ohio, Virginia, and New Hampshire also did immediately, and it was ratified by them immediately. And so this was to say, like, to keep the South from seceding, and they thought there would be an olive branch to them, and the South still rejected it. So 1860, you had take the 70% tariffs, but you get to keep your slaves. The South said no. So you could tell me some kind of argument to how it was only about slavery.
Yeah. And this, of course, famously, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't come until what, 1862, 1863?
63, and it didn't free anybody
63.
because the Emancipation Proclamation only legally affected slaves in rebelling states. So
Exactly.
Slave states or slave counties even that didn't rebel could keep them. And then specifically in the proclamation, once you came back to the Union, your slaves weren't free anymore.
Yep. Yeah, and Lincoln, the Lincoln has a famous quote. I think it was from his 1860 presidential campaign, when he says that he does not believe the federal government has any right to speak on the slavery issue.
Yeah, he had a letter to a reporter from New York. I had it in front of me earlier. I was prepared to read it. Dang, I forgot where it went. Yeah, you're right. And also, I should say the Emancipation Proclamation, as all executive orders are, without ratification and from the Senate, they don't actually do anything. They only control executive agencies. They don't control the law.
Yep. Was it in Kansas, Jason, or goodness, where was it? It might have been in Missouri, where a proto-Emancipation Proclamation was enacted by one of the military dictators there.
Yeah, Fremont.
Yeah, and Lincoln recalled it.
Yeah, Lincoln canned his ass too.
Yeah.
Because, well, he knew that that was going to affect Missouri's status as a state in the Union. Because like this was when Missouri's secession was still up in the air.
Yep.
And he didn't want to make slavery an issue in Missouri at that time because he wanted Missouri on his side.
Yeah.
And the John C. Fremont got too radical for Lincoln at that time.
Yep. Yeah, it was Lincoln never cared about the slavery question until it became pragmatically beneficial to him to do it. Pretty much after England threatened to go to war with Lincoln, and then Lincoln decided that, well, we need to go ahead and keep England out of this war. And so he issued the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yep, and I found the letter. It's the letter to Horace Greeley. It says, quote, this is from Lincoln. As to the policy I seem to be pursuing, as you say, I have not meant to leave anyone in any doubt. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, not to either save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that also. I have stated here my purpose according to my official duty.
Yep.
And then I also have another quote from General William Sherman, which he says, and I quote, this is Sherman saying, I am definitely not an abolitionist. Ain't gonna be no niggers in Uncle Billy's army. End quote.
I hadn't heard that quote before.
Nice.
Yeah, it's the whole framing we have is just so backwards.
I you read that quote from Lincoln about saving the Union, and I've wondered about this for a long time. Like, what is Lincoln's attachment to the Union about?
Yeah.
Because I don't maybe it exists somewhere. Like maybe he wrote about this somewhere that I don't know about, but I haven't seen it. Like, why is he so devoted to the idea of the Union? Because it looks to me like it's almost like a pseudo religious attachment. That's like not even. It's just an article of faith for him.
Yeah.
Because like I don't know what his actual reasoning was behind that.
It had to have been that he was just so dedicated to, he was so lustful over being, he knew that being the Jacobin candidate would get him in office. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of. I don't, there's no other explanation for it that I can see.
If I could say what I think the principled Hamiltonian stance on that would be, is I think the idea is that their entire vision was about the maximum state. And so if they wanted to save the Union, North and South, they could expand West as one unified state, and then they could compete in the world stage, as they wanted that empire, essentially.
Yeah.
Not in like the modern terms that we have it, a multiracial nonsense, but like they wanted that powerful United States that has the economic power to compete with anyone.
Yeah. And I wrote an essay about this, and it's actually one of the things that I really appreciate Pat Buchanan for, because Pat Buchanan recognizes that the GOP has its roots in Lincoln, which is something that is somewhat contradictory to the typical framing that we have, where there was the party switch post-war and the Democrats became the Republicans became Democrats, blah, 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 right? And Pat Buchanan says, well, no, the GOP actually has its roots in Lincoln. But then Buchanan stops short and says, well, actually, though, Lincoln and all of the presidents after Lincoln until, he even says Theodore Roosevelt is included. But basically, all these people are anti-imperialist. And that's the part where I would really take up issue with that, where, well, if you really look at Lincoln's policy, because at that time, the Western territories were foreign territories. It was foreign policy as related to the Western territories. It wasn't domestic policy. And he was absolutely imperialistic. And the GOP was imperialistic in the way that in its foreign policy. To an extent. I mean, obviously, they weren't like imperialistic as relates to Africa, but they were imperialistic as related to the Western territories. Yeah,
and this is kind of, again, I feel like I keep quoting like communists this entire policy, but like it's kind of what Lenin talked about in his thing in imperialism, is that essentially industry and industrialism kind of forces that tendency to expand and be powerful.
Yeah, it has to, because there's no end to it. And at least with like agrarianism, or not even necessarily yeomanry, but even like the planter class, there was only so much land that a planter could own before it was no longer productive for him to own. And he was aware, the planter was aware of that, much less the yeoman who had no slaves, right? He could only work so much land before it was just useless and more expensive for him to own it than anything else. And so there's some kind of natural barrier there that we can't actually expand that far. But the industrialist has no such barrier. The industrialist can colonize the whole world and be economically productive.
And I think that's a really interesting thing that I haven't thought about recently, but I've been thinking about we've been talking about it the last couple of weeks with the difference, like the, fascist and national socialists, and the difference between like real, true traditionalists, is that, they're really like the Roman Empire is really what's, praised, not the Republic at all. And then, you kind of see it in the same thing with the North of the industrialism. It's really about the glory of the state and the state power, and basically just, the awesomeness of conquer and grow and expand. And, that's what's on the mindset, not the interior and the home and the heartland.
Yeah. I mean, that's where, you get the white man's burden out of, New England.
Yeah.
And I suppose at that time it made a little bit more sense when the homeland is at least somewhat stable,
right? That you can kind of focus on Africa or whatnot. But the idea is still the same, that out of this progressive New England industrialist mindset, you get things like the white man's burden, where all of a sudden it's our responsibility to go colonize the whole world. And
Yeah, and they can't do that without the South, which would have been the fourth biggest economy in the world if it had won.
Yeah.
They need the South for their empire.
Exactly.
That's a theory I sort of have about the lost cause narrative. Like, what we think of as the lost cause narrative is that it was pushed partly for the purpose of getting the South back on side for future imperialist expansion starting around the time of the Spanish-American War.
Yeah, and I mean, this is Jeff Davis talks about that with the he talks about when he was Secretary of War, and he had to, as the United States expanded, he had to expand the military accordingly. And he was tasked with writing up a list of the new commanders of these various armies and whatnot. And his list was bent so heavily. His list was based only on merit. That's it. Just on merit and military experience. It was like 90-something% Southern commanders that he proposed. And when it got sent up, it got rejected because there wasn't enough Northerners in there. It's like, well, none of the Northerners are worth a damn militarily. We don't, like, why they don't have merit to be on this list. And that's something that we've seen even in the war itself. All of the great commanders, even on the North, aside from like Sherman and Grant, who weren't really that great as military commanders, one of the truly great Northern military commanders, General Thomas, was a Virginian. And then aside from that, everybody else that we talk about that are like military legends out of that period of American history are Southerners. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Forrest, Stewart. Everyone is a Southerner. The United States needs the South to expand its empire. They have to have it. It's an absolute necessity.
And yeah, they very much made it a point to put some Southern figureheads in the Army when they went to Cuba in 1898. Like they had Wheeler in there, and I think Fitzhugh Lee, and maybe a couple others.
That reminds me of probably my favorite quote from the entire Civil War was Abraham Lincoln is once noted to have an exchange with General Winfield Scott about how, they were having trouble with the South. And he said this quote verbatim. He said, "Why is it that we were able to take the city of Mexico in 3 months with 5,000 men, and we've been unable to take Richmond with 100,000 men?" And Scott replied, "I will tell you, the men who took us into the city of Mexico are the same ones who are keeping us out of Richmond."
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so true. That's, if all things were equal and the blockade did not exist, the South wipes the floor with the North in a purely military contest. 100%. I mean, every single time. They were so unequal in their military skill, resiliency, just ability to absorb massive damage. I mean, the entire war was fought on the South's homeland. Aside from really Gettysburg, nothing was fought in the North.
I think that's true at the highest levels of command. But when you get down, below the corps level, I'm not sure if it holds true anymore. The Western theater is quite a bit less successful for the South than the Eastern theater was. Same goes for the Trans-Mississippi. But you got Lee and Jackson and the big ones. The death of Albert Sidney Johnston at Shiloh is a really big deal too. That's one of those
death also.
That's one of those big tipping points that you're like, oh, if they hadn't lost him, what would he have done?
Yeah.
But I don't know. I don't think it's maybe if you set the numbers equal and the South wipes the floor with the North, and it's definitely true that even with the defeats in the West, the South still punches above its weight for a long time as far as numbers go. But I'm not sure the difference is as much as it's cracked up to be by Southern apologists all the time.
Mhm.
You know, and it's fair enough. Like, I think we tend to romanticize the side we like.
Yeah,
Mhm.
of course.
But yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't studied the merits of all the various generals enough to be able to make a call about that. But
Yeah.
you know, because we always focus on the East, like the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee and Jackson, and all that. And it's worth a mention, at least, that the armies in the West were quite a bit less successful.
That's very
Mhm.
true. Yeah. And
Well, I think the point of this, you know, when you get into like, you know, who's better soldiers one for one, and kind of get into the hypotheticals. I think
Yeah.
really the point of what we're getting at is that we were very powerful and, like, you know, competent military commanders. It is so much that the North needed the South for the empire.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I I can't imagine. I don't know what would have happened in Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam, we got our ass kicked, but
We
Vietnam,
actually
Korea.
we actually did very well militarily in Vietnam. We policy wise got our act.
Yes.
Yeah.
But Korea, World War I, World War II. I
Yeah.
mean, it's all hypothetical, but what would have happened had the South, not sent men to
Mhm.
die?
Yeah.
It's
Exactly.
it's an interesting hypothetical. I don't know.
Yeah, that's one of those things. Like, do we even get involved in World War One if the South wins the Civil War?
Right.
Yeah,
And
that
we're,
is a
and we're
cool.
not a unified
Mhm.
nation anymore in the early 20th century. Yeah,
Yeah,
who
I
knows?
can't imagine so.
I
Yeah,
think the more interesting thing is if we get into say the South wins, say we get into subsequent wars over the Western territories that haven't quite fully been taken yet.
Yeah. Yeah, it would have been a whole different North America had the
Mhm.
South won the war.
Very.
It
yeah.
would have been completely different.
Well, we've gone quite a bit longer than 3 hours.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So, one last thing, Marco, I think I forgot to ask Alex this on the last show, but I want to ask if you know what the title of our show is referencing. I'm going to ask every guest this until somebody gets it.
Is it referencing like the cramp that you get in your leg?
Well, it is a pun on that, but no.
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
All right. Well, there's a very specific reference that I had in mind when I came up with this. So it's gonna remain a mystery for now, and I'm gonna keep asking everybody until somebody gets it. So if you're
Oh,
the
dang.
next guest, you can do your research and find out.
All right. I will do my research.
So with that, thanks for coming on.
This was great.
It's been
That
really
was
good.
my
I think
pleasure.
this essay was a little bit more up the alley of both me and John than the last one. Like, the last
Yeah.
one was about art, and we're like,
Oh yeah.
we're both Philistines. So this one was quite a bit more historical.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's been a really good time. And thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, thank y'all so much for having me on. It was wonderful to talk about it. And I can talk about history and random subjects all day. So it was really my pleasure.
Yeah, for sure. So next time we're going to have our next show is going to be on Saturday, July 18th, and we're going to have Fisto Sabani on to talk about the next essay in the book, which is Education Past and Present by John Gould Fletcher. And it's about we're having Fisto on because he's a teacher. He's a high school teacher in his real life job.
Yeah. And this marks what, 3 in a row with Orthodox Christians?
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah. Alexandru, and now Marco, and then Fisto next time.
Yep. So looking forward to that. Join us on July 18th. We're going to be back to our normal first and third Saturday for the next show. We didn't do this one on Saturday because Saturday's the 4th of July.
Yeah.
But we'll be back to the normal schedule for next time. So is there anything you want to tell people about before we sign off?
Nothing that I can think of. Thank y'all, and thank God, and God bless the South.
Amen. All right. Well, go follow Society of Archangel Michael on Substack. Follow John and me. Listen to my other podcast. Read John's Substack at Bright Sunny South. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
See ya.